Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I was driving my nightly patrol through the dark, deserted roads of Maple Grove, Texas, when the radio crackled to life with a voice I'd never forget. It was a late October night, the kind of night when the wind howls low over empty fields, and the moon hangs like a silent sentinel in the sky. My truck's headlights cut through the oppressive darkness as I navigated narrow country roads lined with gnarled oak trees and long stretches of barren, open land. I remember the dial reading 2:15 a.m., a time when the world felt inexplicably fragile, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The call came out of nowhere, a trembling, almost desperate whisper. "Officer, please, I think someone's in my house." The voice, strained with terror, held an urgency that shook me to my core. I told him to remain calm, my own hand gripping the radio tighter, every instinct alert for danger. There was a pause, a suffocating silence punctuated only by rapid, shallow breathing, before the line suddenly went dead. I tried redialing, but each attempt meant nothing more than the cold emptiness of voicemail. The dispatcher's instructions and the details of the call replayed in my mind like a broken record, urging me to investigate before something irreversible occurred. I made my way to the address provided, a location on the outskirts of town that, according to my map, should have registered as a modest dwelling in a quiet residential stretch. Yet, as my vehicle slowed and the surroundings came into view, confusion gnawed at me. Instead of a house, there was nothing but endless open fields stretching into the horizon, punctuated by the faint silhouettes of distant trees. The chill in the air matched the increasing dread in my chest. Despite the discrepancy between the call and what lay before me, my training and duty compelled me to search further. Pulling off the main road, I noticed a subtle glimmer, a solitary light flickering on the porch of a small farmhouse, a few hundred yards down a narrow, gravel-lined drive. I checked the address once again in my radio log. It matched perfectly. With a heavy mix of apprehension and determination, I stepped out of my patrol car. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the old structure, its weathered wood and dim porch light evoking a sense of neglect that contrasted sharply with the urgency in that desperate voice on the radio. At the door stood a young man with wary eyes, his face etched with confusion and exhaustion. I introduced myself and explained the situation, my voice calm yet laced with professional concern. "I got a call from a number near here, someone saying there was trouble," I said. His response was puzzling. "There's no one else around," he replied slowly, almost as if speaking to himself, and insisted that this farmhouse was all that existed in the immediate vicinity. His tone was steady, yet his eyes betrayed a quiet, unresolved fear. I couldn't shake the dissonance between his calm demeanor and the panic in that earlier call. In that moment, I felt the weight of responsibility and the first pangs of foreboding. Something wasn't right in this quiet corner of the world. Reluctantly, I made my way back to my patrol car, my mind awash with unsettling questions. The radio remained silent, stubbornly unresponsive to my repeated attempts, intensifying the haunting feeling that I'd been drawn into a trap beyond ordinary explanation. As I stepped into my vehicle and turned the key, a frozen dread gripped me. In the rearview mirror, I caught sight of a figure seated in the back seat, a dark, indistinct shape that shouldn't have been there. I slowed, heart pounding in my ears, and tried to focus on this anomaly as the figure's presence radiated a chill that penetrated every fiber of my being. Before I could reach for the radio or call for backup, a heavy blow struck me from behind. The shock of the impact reverberated through my skull, and a searing flash of pain burst behind my eyes, swallowing my consciousness in a sea of darkness. When I finally awoke, I found myself in a stark hospital room where the harsh white lights assaulted my recovering vision. I lay in a bed with a dull, throbbing ache, remnants of the night's violence pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Nurses and fellow officers hovered near my bedside, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and disbelief as they recounted the events that led them to discover my battered form slumped in my patrol car near that very farmhouse. Their words blended into a murmur of routine procedure. A search yielded no trace of the mysterious figure, no incriminating evidence, nothing but my solitary suffering. As the hours passed in that sterile room, the fragments of my memory battled to coalesce into a coherent narrative. I recalled every detail, the eeriness of the open fields, the desperate tone of that unknown caller, the young man's disjointed explanation at the farmhouse, and, most disturbingly, the silhouette in my car that had vanished without a trace. Yet, despite my desperate attempts at rationalizing the experience as a trick of exhaustion or a figment of a nightmarish imagination, an unyielding certainty had seeped into my soul. I had seen something that defied logic. While my colleagues insisted that their investigation revealed nothing, I couldn't help but feel that I was at the center of an anomaly that transcended ordinary human experience. Over the next several days, as I struggled to piece together the events, nightmares plagued my sleep. I found myself haunted by the memory of that dark figure. Its eyes, glinting with an otherworldly intensity, seemed to follow me wherever I went. I revisited the area around the farmhouse on my days off, driven by an insatiable need to uncover the truth behind the inexplicable. Every visit revealed little more than what I'd already seen, a desolate, forgotten field, marked only by a few battered wooden signs and remnants of old, crumbling fences. Yet, on one such visit, as I stood silently in the cold, damp darkness, I discovered something that shattered any semblance of normalcy I once clung to. Carved into a weathered post at the edge of the field were my initials, J.M. I stared at those jagged letters, a chill of recognition flooding through me. Questions raced through my mind. Had I been here before, under different circumstances? Was my mind playing tricks, or was someone, or something, manipulating reality itself? I trudged back to my car, the weight of that revelation nearly crushing my spirit. Every step was heavy with dread, and the silence of the night seemed to mock my futile search for understanding. The encounter had transformed from a simple call to a labyrinth of terror and uncertainty, an experience that questioned not only my sense of duty, but also the very essence of my identity. As I drove back to the station, the road blurred by the tears of rain that had begun to fall. I couldn't shake the unsettling awareness that the night's events were far from over. There was a presence that defied explanation, and with each mile I put behind me, it felt as though that invisible specter was drawing ever closer, a silent witness to my unraveling. I spent the remainder of that night in a haze of doubt, grappling with the conflicting narratives of duty and personal horror. The hospital's antiseptic corridors provided no solace, only stark reminders of my own vulnerability. In the quiet moments before sleep, memories of that shadowed figure and the inexplicable carving of my initials stirred within me an overwhelming sense of isolation and despair. The more I tried to reconcile the logical with the paranormal, the deeper I fell into a vortex of fear and self-doubt, a dark precipice from which there seemed to be no return. And so, even as the sun reluctantly rose over the horizon the next morning, its pale light doing little to dispel the lingering darkness in my mind. I realized that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. As I attempted to resume the monotonous rhythm of my daily duties, the incident followed me like a persistent whisper in every quiet corner of Maple Grove. The local community remained oblivious to the ghostly terror that had infiltrated my patrol that fateful night. Yet I was unmistakably marked by its presence. Colleagues regarded my experience with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism, cautioning me to be careful with my recollections lest they be dismissed as mere effects of post-traumatic stress. I, however, could not ignore the gnawing feeling that I had inadvertently stepped into a realm where the boundary between life and death, reality and nightmare, had become irreparably blurred. In the ensuing days, restless nights became my constant companion as I scoured every file and record at the station for any link to that untraceable address or the mysterious caller. The investigation led me through a web of overlooked reports, unconnected anomalies, and eerie coincidences. Every conversation on the precinct's worn-out intercom, every hushed whisper in the break room seemed to carry an undercurrent of something sinister lurking beneath the ordinary. The more I delved, the more it became apparent that Maple Grove held secrets well beyond the comprehension of its unsuspecting residents. And as I pieced together fragments of testimonies from long-retired officers and local townsfolk who spoke of ghostly apparitions and inexplicable vanishings, the magnitude of what I had encountered began to reveal itself in terrifying clarity. The deeper I dug, the more I found my own history intertwined with the fabric of this small town's folklore. A long-forgotten scandal involving a string of disappearances decades ago, whispered accounts of a vengeful spirit taking the form of a lost son, and even hints that my own family might have been entangled in these dark events. All of it coalesced into a portrait of Maple Grove as a crucible of restless souls and buried sins. Every shadow on the periphery of my vision was now imbued with an ominous significance. Every creak in the silence of my office at night, a reminder that there were forces at work that no amount of training or rational thought could ever hope to understand. I eventually returned to the abandoned field under the oppressive veil of dusk. The rain had subsided to a quiet drizzle, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. I walked slowly, nearly mechanically, toward the weathered post where my initials were etched deep into the wood. My hands trembled as I traced the letters with a calloused fingertip, each stroke an echo of my internal torment. In that solitary moment, it seemed as though the darkness itself was breathing, its silent exhalations caressing the edges of my sanity. The field, with its unending rows of wild, untamed grass, and the distant mournful cry of a night bird, whispered unspeakable truths that I wasn't sure I was meant to hear. I pressed on into the night, driven by a need to confront the inexplicable horrors that had invaded my life. The further I ventured, the more palpable the atmosphere of dread became. Shadows danced at the fringes of my vision, and at times I swore I could hear the faint echo of whispered voices, a chorus of desperate pleas and mournful lamentations that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath my feet. In moments of fleeting clarity, I recalled the young man's puzzled expression, the subtle wariness in his eyes as he denied the existence of anything amiss. His words had hinted at a hidden truth, a dark secret nestled within the seemingly tranquil facade of this forgotten land. And as I trudged deeper into that forbidding expanse, the idea that I was being led into a trap crafted by forces beyond mortal control grew more compelling with each step. The revelations mounted gradually, their weight crushing the fragile remnants of my once steadfast resolve. I began noticing patterns, a recurring series of unexplained occurrences that seemed to converge on the very night of the attack. A peculiar shift in the local radio frequency late at night, inexplicable echoes in empty rooms, and an ever-present sense of being watched haunted my every move. Each discovery chipped away at my certainty, forcing me to confront the possibility that the horrors I had encountered were not isolated events, but part of a larger, malevolent tapestry woven into the very fabric of Maple Grove. The nights turned into an endless parade of torment. Every time I closed my eyes, vivid images of that shadowed figure would surge forth, its eyes burning with a predatory intensity. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if the relentless pressure was distorting my perceptions of reality. Friends and colleagues advised me to take leave, to step back from a case that appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate illusion born out of exhaustion and grief. Yet, no matter how much I tried to distance myself, the relentless pull of that mystery, of the unyielding darkness that had claimed me so completely, kept drawing me back. I was caught in a vicious cycle of investigation and dread, an inescapable nightmare from which each new revelation only deepened the torment. In those long, sleepless hours, I documented every detail, every fleeting sensation, desperate to capture the truth before it slipped away like smoke through my trembling fingers. The pages of my notebook overflowed with hurried scrawls, incomplete observations, and questions that had no immediate answers. I documented the distinct chill in the air as I approached the farmhouse, the subtle sound of my own heartbeat echoing in the silence, and the unbearable weight of knowing that something was watching me from the darkness. With every step, it became painfully evident. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and the truth, however horrifying it might be, was something I could no longer afford to ignore. Eventually, that relentless pursuit led me back to the very crossroads where it all began. The world around me seemed to recoil from the revelations as I re-entered the boundaries of Maple Grove, the overgrown paths and derelict buildings resonating with memories of ancient sins and whispered curses. Every street corner held the promise of a hidden secret. Every creaking door murmured of lives lost and promises broken. And though I was exhausted beyond measure, I sensed with every fiber of my being that the final piece of the puzzle was dangerously close, waiting to be uncovered, just beyond the next shadow, just beyond the next heartbeat. Even now, as I recount these events in the solitude of another long, sleepless night, I can't help but feel that the true horror was only beginning. The unanswered questions, the inexplicable presence that seemed to defy logic, and the ever-looming specter of my own past conspired to create a terror that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The memory of that night, etched into my soul, and bleeding into every subsequent moment, remains a constant reminder of the dark underbelly of reality. A reality that, no matter how much I wished it were otherwise, could not be erased. I stepped away from the post, leaving behind the carved initials that marked me as both a witness and a victim. The silent field stretched out before me like an endless void, and as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the ominous sensation that I was being watched by a presence as ancient and inscrutable as time itself. The wind whispered through the long grass, carrying with it echoes of distant lamentations and promises of reckoning. My heart pounded with the realization that the answers I sought might come at a price far greater than I was prepared to pay, a price measured not in dollars or fear, but in the very sanity of my soul. Driving back to the precinct in the early hours of dawn, every red light and stop sign became a temporary sanctuary from the relentless tide of memories flooding my mind. I knew that the investigation was far from over, even if my superiors dismissed it as a convergence of misfortune and stress. I had seen something that night, something that defied explanation and seemed to belong to a realm where human logic held no sway. And as the first hints of daylight bled into the sky, I vowed silently that I would not rest until I had unearthed every dark secret Maple Grove had hidden away in its forgotten corners. The journey that began with a single desperate call had transformed into a personal odyssey, a descent into a labyrinth of horror and despair that threatened to consume every facet of my existence. I was no longer just an officer on patrol. I was a reluctant pilgrim seeking truth in the heart of darkness, burdened by memories that would not let me go. And with each passing moment, the line between my duty to protect and the call to uncover forbidden mysteries blurred ever further, leading me inexorably toward an end that I could neither foresee nor escape. I pulled into the empty parking lot of the old station that morning, my hands still trembling as I clutched the steering wheel. The building, with its faded insignia and tired facade, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a final waypoint in a journey that had eroded the boundaries of my own identity. Inside, whispers of concern mixed with skeptical looks from my colleagues, yet none of them could see the shattered fragments of truth that lay splintered inside me. I filed my report with mechanical precision, each word a desperate attempt to rationalize what I had witnessed, even as the unspeakable reality lurked just beneath the surface of my every thought. Days turned into restless weeks as I sought solace in routine, a futile effort to bury the nightmares under layers of paperwork and the monotony of daily patrols. But no matter how hard I tried to return to normalcy, the lingering presence of that night remained, a constant, unwelcome companion. Every creak of the station door, every echoing footstep in the empty corridors, reminded me that the darkness I had encountered was not bound by time or space. It was a living, breathing entity that had found a way to root itself into the very fabric of my being, waiting patiently for the next opportunity to reveal its true nature. In quiet moments, when the hum of the night shift lulled me into a false sense of calm, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that moved against the grain of reality, a flicker of light where there should have been none. I'd shake my head, chiding myself for letting fear cloud my judgment, but deep down I knew that the truth was far more complex and horrifying than any simple explanation could offer. I began to document these encounters meticulously, compiling an ever-growing dossier of strange happenings, unexplained sounds, and fleeting apparitions that defied logical explanation. Each page of my journal was a step further into a nightmare from which I could not awake. The deeper I delved into the mysteries of Maple Grove, the more I uncovered a pattern, an intricate tapestry of loss, regret, and something else entirely. A lurking despair that had seeped into the very soul of this place. A series of unsolved cases from decades past, each with its own chilling details, began to interlock with my own experience. Rumors of spirits roaming the abandoned lanes, of cursed land where the past refused to rest, and of unspeakable acts hidden beneath layers of time, all emerged like ghosts from the fog. I encountered old-timers in the local diner who muttered about the curse of the lost, their eyes distant and haunted, as if they bore witness to horrors beyond the ken of ordinary mortals. Their fragmented tales, while steeped in superstition, resonated with the undeniable evidence of the terror I had experienced. Every clue forced me to confront a disturbing possibility, that the inexplicable events weren't random acts of violence or hallucinations spawned by isolation and fatigue, but rather deliberate, malevolent forces that had been at work in Maple Grove long before I ever set foot on those lonely roads. In the dead hours of each night, as I pored over old police reports and newspaper clippings in the dim light of my cramped apartment, the lines between detective work and a descent into madness blurred. I questioned my own memories and, at times, my very identity. Was it possible that I was entangled in an ancient cycle of terror, doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past in a relentless spiral of violence and despair? I found no definitive answers, only the ever-deepening chasm of uncertainty and fear. And yet, despite the mounting evidence and the haunting whispers of forgotten tragedies, I could not abandon my pursuit. The mystery had become a part of me, an inescapable chain that tethered my sanity to a dark legacy hidden within the heart of Maple Grove. Every uncovered secret, every inexplicable occurrence only deepened my resolve to confront that which defied understanding, even if it meant surrendering every ounce of hope I had left. As I drove back home on another rain-slicked night, the windshield wipers clicking in a measured rhythm, I realized that my journey was far from complete. The haunting images of that shadowed figure, the carved initials echoing my own identity, and the murmurs of a tortured past reverberated in my mind with relentless persistence. The final pieces of this nightmarish puzzle remained tantalizingly out of reach, daring me to uncover the hidden truth that lay beneath the surface of every whispered secret and every chilling silence. And in that moment, as I merged onto the lonely highway under a starless sky, I couldn't help but wonder, was I chasing a phantom, a specter born from my own tormented memories? Or was there a greater, more sinister force at work in the dark corners of Maple Grove? Driving on, I felt an undeniable chill deep within my bones, the realization that the night had only just begun to reveal its true horror. Even as I sought refuge in the familiar routines of my duty, the specter of that fateful night loomed large, ever ready to shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy. The unanswered questions, the cumulative weight of decades-old mysteries, and the ever-persistent whisper of an ancient curse led me inexorably toward a final confrontation with the unknown. A confrontation that promised to unravel all that I had once held true, leaving behind only a lingering despair and a twist of fate that would haunt me long after the darkness had finally receded. And so, as the miles melted away under the relentless passage of time, I prepared myself for what I sensed was the inevitable climax of a sinister journey. One that might not only reveal the hidden depths of Maple Grove's cursed legacy, but also expose the darkest corners of my own soul. The road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, each twist and turn a gateway to a nightmare I was both desperate to escape and inextricably bound to confront. With every heartbeat, I inched closer to that final, fateful moment where the past and present would collide, and the true nature of the terror that had taken root in my life would finally be laid bare. As the night deepened and I continued my solitary drive along the silent highways, I couldn't help but wonder if I was truly prepared for what lay ahead. The weight of countless unanswered questions pressed down on me, each one a silent harbinger of the truth that waited in the shadows. And as I looked out into the endless dark, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight, one thought in particular chilled me to the core. A single, unyielding question that refused to let go. What if the horror I had seen was not an isolated nightmare after all, but merely the beginning of an even more disturbing reality? I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, the engine's steady hum a desperate counterpoint to the pounding of my heart, as I drove on into a future fraught with dread and unanswered mysteries. Every turn on that ill-fated road, every whispered secret in the wind, and every flicker of inexplicable light had led me here. In the aftermath of that long, crushing ordeal, I became increasingly aware of the intricate tapestry of fate that wove together the lives of those who had crossed paths with the darkness of Maple Grove. Night after night, as I patrolled the abandoned outskirts of this haunted town, I noticed subtle signs that hinted at a presence that transcended the boundaries of natural explanation. A door left ajar in a derelict building, a reflection in a storefront window that vanished when confronted, and an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere whenever I neared the old farmhouse. All these anomalies pointed to a relentless, unseen force at work. I began to confide in a few trusted colleagues, albeit hesitantly, recounting every detail of that fateful night and the dread that had since taken up residence in my mind. Their reactions were mixed. Some nodded in quiet understanding, their own eyes revealing glimpses of buried memories best left undisturbed. Others dismissed my accounts as the byproduct of too many late-night shifts and too little rest. Yet, even as they urged me to let go of the past and focus on the present, I found myself inexorably drawn back to the mystery, a dark allure that promised both danger and the possibility of redemption. One chilly evening, as autumn gave way to the first hints of winter, I received an anonymous note slipped under the door of my modest apartment. The note, written in spidery, almost desperate handwriting, simply read, "The truth is hidden where the past meets the present. Do you dare look?" That single line sent a shiver down my spine and ignited a determination that bordered on obsession. My days became a blur of grueling shifts, fervent research, and fevered visits to every possible location connected to the strange events in Maple Grove. I revisited the farmhouse, interrogated old-timers at the diner, scoured archives for any mention of my initials or the inexplicable symbols carved into the old posts. Each new discovery seemed to peel away another layer of reality, revealing an underbelly rife with secrets that made my blood run cold. My nights were the worst. Alone in the dim light of my study, with rain tapping incessantly on the window, I pored over ancient maps, newspaper clippings, and scribbled notes in a desperate bid to find coherence in the chaos. The faces of those lost to time, of victims claimed by forces unseen, haunted me until the early hours of the morning. I began to experience moments of déjà vu, fleeting but vivid recollections of a time and place that seemed intimately connected to the current horror. Was it possible that the memories I believed were my own had been planted long ago, intertwined with the dark legacy of Maple Grove? Every unanswered question, every inexplicable detail, deepened the chasm between the world I knew and the sinister truths lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. As the investigation stretched on, I found myself increasingly isolated. Friends and family grew distant, unable to understand the depths of my torment or the relentless pull of a mystery that refused to be unraveled. The faces of my colleagues began to blur with those of strangers whose haunted eyes stared back at me from the sepia-toned photographs in old case files. I even started to lose sleep, my mind a chaotic battleground where reason warred with terror, and every tick of the clock was a reminder of the impending inevitability of fate. My every instinct screamed that something was coming, an ominous reckoning that would force me to confront the darkest corners of my past and the inexplicable reality that now consumed me. One fateful night, as I returned to the precinct after a long shift, a subtle but chilling sensation washed over me. The corridors were eerily silent, the usual hum of activity replaced by an almost palpable stillness. In that moment, I felt the oppressive weight of unseen eyes following my every step. The glowing lights overhead flickered briefly, as if disturbed by an invisible force, and I wondered if it was just a malfunction or a silent warning. I tried to shake off the discomfort, attributing it to fatigue and the lingering memories of that brutal encounter. Yet the feeling persisted as I made my way to the evidence locker, a place that now seemed to harbor more questions than answers. Inside that cold, dark room, surrounded by boxes of forgotten artifacts and dusty relics of unsolved cases, I discovered something that sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. Taped to the back of one of the boxes was a faded photograph of the old farmhouse, taken decades ago. In the background of the image, almost hidden by the passing of time, was a figure whose eyes burned with an intensity that was all too familiar. A face that mirrored my own haunted expression from that long, dreadful night. My hands trembled as I examined the photograph, each detail etching itself into my memory. The angles of the building, the placement of that solitary light on the porch, even the way the night seemed to swallow the edges of the frame. It was as if the picture had been deliberately planted to tell me something I wasn't ready to accept. I remember that night as if it were etched into my very soul, a night that still haunts every quiet moment I steal between shifts. The call came in as I was patrolling a desolate stretch of Burlington's outskirts. A trespassing report at the old McNeil mansion on the banks of the Delaware River had set my pulse racing. I pulled my cruiser to a stop beneath the low-hanging trees, their silhouettes trembling against the weak glow of a cloud-obscured moon. The mansion loomed in the distance, a crumbling relic built in 1894 for Andrew H. McNeil and his family, abandoned since 1974. Its dark windows like eyes peering into a secret past. With a mix of duty and dread, I radioed dispatch for backup and proceeded cautiously toward the property, my every sense on high alert as the cool night air pressed against me. My footsteps on the cracked pavement sounded unnaturally loud as I approached the mansion, the weight of responsibility heavy on my shoulders. I recalled the warnings. Burlington was notorious for its unsettling history and disproportionate crime statistics, but it was the uncanny legends of this very mansion that sent a shiver down my spine. As I examined the perimeter, I discovered a smashed lower window that beckoned me inside. The glass shards glittered like malevolent stars on the ground, and the whispered sound of a gentle wind mingled with my own rapid breathing. My grip on the radio tightened as I announced, "Officer Davis here. I'm entering the premises, requesting immediate backup." The static in the response did nothing to ease the nervous flutter in my chest. Stepping through the broken window, I was met by a musty, suffocating darkness, punctuated only by the intermittent beams of my flashlight. The living room lay in disarray. Decades of neglect had transformed the once grand space into a chaotic jumble of broken furniture, debris and remnants of a life long past. Each careful step disturbed a thin blanket of dust that seemed to cling to every surface, as though the mansion itself mourned its lost vibrancy. Every creak of the old floorboards under my weight resonated in my ears like an ominous drumbeat. Despite my training and the steady presence of my hand resting near my holster, an overwhelming sense of isolation and foreboding began to creep in. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional rustling of loose paper and the distant sound of dripping water echoing down a long corridor. Moving cautiously toward a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into the murk, I couldn't help but question the nature of this intrusion. Had these trespassers expected to find solace in a dilapidated relic of the past? My mind raced through rational possibilities, but deep down, I sensed that something was profoundly wrong. As I ascended, the air grew colder, and my flashlight flickered in a way that made me doubt its reliability. I reached a landing where the corridor bifurcated into several narrow hallways. In one of those hallways, a soft, almost imperceptible thud came from behind a closed door. My heart pounded, and I hesitated. A brief moment where instinct and duty warred within me. I whispered, as if to reassure myself more than any unseen threat, "Stay focused, Officer Davis. It's just a trespasser." But the tremor in my voice betrayed the uncertainty gnawing at me. I pressed on, every step laden with the silent prayer that this was a mundane break-in rather than something far more sinister. I pushed open a heavy door into a cramped study that still held traces of its former grandeur. Faded wallpaper and dusty portraits of somber-faced ancestors looked on as I methodically scanned the room. The only light came from the narrow slit of a grimy window, and a single beam from my flashlight danced over a desk cluttered with antique papers and a shattered porcelain vase. The room's silence was suddenly broken by the sound of labored breathing from the hallway behind me, a noise that didn't match the empty calm. I spun around, my hand inching closer to my sidearm, and called out, "Show yourself!" The response was a cold, hollow echo that seemed to come from every corner of the mansion. It felt as though I was not alone, as though the mansion itself was alive with unseen watchers. The investigation deepened as I explored further, descending into the winding corridors and shadowed rooms of the mansion. With each step, the psychological pressure mounted. I encountered rooms where the remnants of a luxurious past lay scattered in disarray. Shattered crystal on the floor, torn drapes fluttering as though disturbed by an unseen presence, and furniture draped in white sheets that resembled silent, ghostly sentinels. In one particularly narrow hall, I found a series of faded photographs pinned haphazardly to the wall, images of a family whose eyes seemed to implore a story lost in time. I paused, feeling a poignant mix of sorrow and alarm, wondering if these restless spirits were part of the mystery I was trying to unravel. Despite my skepticism as a police officer grounded in reality, the overwhelming ambience of despair and regret in that room made me question the boundaries between the material and the spectral. The mansion itself became a character in my unfolding ordeal, a labyrinth of memories and shadows. I ventured into a cramped passageway where the oppressive air and the distant sound of footsteps created a palpable sense of impending dread. I could no longer rely solely on the clarity of my training. Instinct and raw emotion began to intertwine, creating an unsettling cocktail of determination and despair. My thoughts drifted to earlier calls, the mundane incidents of theft and vandalism that now paled in comparison to the surreal terror that enveloped me. Every creak of the ancient wood, every subtle shift in the atmosphere, heightened my awareness of a presence that was both external and disturbingly internal. I often found myself grappling with the notion that perhaps the mansion was a repository of every unspoken fear, every suppressed memory of those who once called it home. In the dim light, the walls seemed to pulsate with life, and for a moment, I felt as if the building itself was trying to communicate its dark secrets. As I pressed deeper into the mansion's heart, I discovered a narrow set of stairs leading to a second-floor corridor lined with rooms that whispered of past tragedies. The corridors were bathed in a spectral glow that did little to alleviate the overwhelming sense of isolation. I opened a door cautiously and was met by the overwhelming odor of mildew and decay. In the corner, a broken mirror reflected my own anxious face back at me, a stark reminder that even in the midst of supernatural-seeming occurrences, I remained painfully human. I moved to the next room and found personal belongings strewn about in disarray. A child's toy, a half-burned photograph, and a diary with pages filled in trembling handwriting. Flipping through the diary, my breath caught as I read fragments of despair, anger, and foreboding. The words spoke of loss, betrayal, and a darkness that crept into every waking moment. It was as if the mansion was not just a haunted relic, but a monument to a tragedy that had long ago been buried, only to resurface on nights like these. I was interrupted by a sudden heavy thud coming from outside, a sound that echoed in the vast emptiness of the hall. My radio crackled, barely audible beneath the pounding of my heart. "Officer Davis, report in. Any sign of—" The words died on my tongue as I strained my ears, trying to decode the symphony of noises that now punctuated my investigation. The soft weeping of wind, the low groans of settling wood, and a desperate, irregular cadence that almost resembled footsteps. It was at that moment that I realized I was not chasing mere vandals or thrill-seekers. This was something else. A creeping, sinister force that clawed at the edges of my sanity and made me question the very nature of what I was confronting. The mansion's oppressive atmosphere wrapped around me like a shroud, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, even as my duty kept me rooted in place. With every step I took, the boundary between objective duty and subjective terror began to blur. I found myself pacing hallways where I could sense eyes watching me, and I caught fleeting glimpses of figures in the periphery of my vision, shapes that vanished as soon as I focused on them. In one particularly harrowing moment, I heard a voice, soft and mournful, drifting from a hidden corner of the mansion. "Help me." It was not a shout, but a quiet lament that seemed to resonate directly in my chest. I froze, the chill of that single word infecting my blood with ice. I reloaded my weapon, trying to convince myself that it was merely an echo of my own imagination, a trick played by isolation and fatigue. But as I moved further into the darkness, the strain on my nerves grew too heavy to bear. I questioned if I was still chasing a trespasser, or if I had inadvertently stepped into a realm where logic and reason no longer applied. Every room, every corridor of that forsaken mansion brought new revelations and new horrors. I began to piece together the fragments of a story that extended far beyond a simple break-in. It was as if the mansion had absorbed the tragic energies of every soul that had ever haunted its halls, and now they sought to speak through the silence. My training as an officer, the hardened rationality of my everyday life, was slowly eroding under the weight of memories that were not my own. The despair in the diary, the silent testimony of broken objects, and the inexplicable phenomena I witnessed combined to form an overwhelming narrative of loss and betrayal. I realized that I was not just investigating a scene of criminal trespass. I was becoming entangled in a web of sorrow and malevolence spun over decades. The line between duty and personal torment blurred further when I caught sight of a familiar relic, a badge tarnished and engraved with the name of a fallen officer whose image had haunted me in childhood. The coincidence, or perhaps a cruel twist of fate, sent waves of guilt and fear crashing over me. As the night wore on and the mansion's secrets deepened, I experienced moments of emotional breakdown that left me questioning my own sanity. In a quiet, forgotten room dominated by a single, cracked window, I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability. I sank onto an old, dusty armchair and closed my eyes, trying to gather the scattered pieces of my courage. In that fleeting interlude, I felt as though I were reaching out to the lost souls of the mansion, seeking solace in the shared pain of our existence. Tears, hot and unbidden, traced silent paths down my cheeks as I listened to the inconsolable whispers carried by the wind. It was a moment that shattered the stoic facade I had clung to for so long, a reminder that even a hardened police officer is not immune to the crushing weight of despair. I could almost feel the tangible presence of sorrow hovering beside me, a silent companion that made every breath a battle between hope and hopelessness. I clutched my radio as I forced myself to rise, determined to continue my duty despite the darkness that threatened to consume me. The mansion, with its labyrinthine corridors and unyielding gloom, still harbored secrets that needed to be unearthed. I resumed my investigation with the same grim determination that had defined my career, though every step was now laden with the raw, unfiltered agony of confronting the inexplicable. The echoes of my own faltering heartbeats became the soundtrack to my solitary quest through the mansion's decaying entrails. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes tracking my every move, and each new discovery deepened the mystery of what lay beyond the veil of normalcy. I began to suspect that the mansion itself was a vessel, a repository for the emotions of those it had once sheltered and those it now condemned. And as I pushed onward, a singular, horrifying thought gnawed at my resolve. If the ghosts of the past were as real as my trembling hand on the radio, what then remained of the present? The silence was eventually broken by the arrival of my backup. The steady hum of additional officers and the sudden burst of coordinated voices providing a temporary reprieve from the suffocating solitude. We regrouped in the foyer, where the faint traces of fading golden light from a street lamp fought a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. I recounted my discoveries, my voice a blend of professional detachment and personal fear. My colleagues, seasoned and battle-hardened, exchanged uneasy glances as they absorbed the gravity of my words. Together, we scoured the mansion, retracing my steps and exploring every hidden niche in search of evidence. Yet, for all our efforts, the presence that had plagued me throughout the night remained elusive, like a shadow that danced just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Our search led us to a narrow, secluded corridor that ended in a small chamber adorned with relics of a bygone era, a room where the air felt heavier and time itself appeared to be suspended. There, among the scattered remnants of the past, we found a series of cryptic notes scribbled on worn pieces of paper. They hinted at secret rituals, desperate pleas for redemption, and a profound sense of abandonment that seemed to echo the mansion's very foundation. I held one of the fragile sheets in my hands as I read, each word intensifying the mystery. It was clear that the occupants of this place had suffered unspeakable torment, their voices silenced by a force that refused to let them go. In that room, the oppressive atmosphere reached its zenith, and I could no longer ignore the feeling that I had become an unwitting participant in a cosmic tragedy, one that defied the straightforward logic of my training as a police officer. Even as we prepared to call it a night and leave the mansion behind, a final, inexplicable incident forced me to pause. One of the backup officers discovered a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a crevice behind an old bookshelf in the corridor. The journal's entries were fragmented, yet they spoke with clarity of a relentless darkness creeping into the lives of those who sought refuge within these walls. There were meticulous accounts of moments filled with terror, accounts that described sensations of suffocating despair and the profound isolation of being trapped between life and death. As I flipped through the fragile pages, I realized that these entries were not written by a mere trespasser, but by someone who had once been intimately acquainted with the mansion's malevolent nature. The words etched there resonated with the same dread I had been feeling all night. And in that moment I understood that the mansion was more than an abandoned structure. It was an enduring monument to suffering, a place where hope had long been extinguished and replaced by an ever-present gnawing sense of loss. Even with the tangible evidence in our hands, the night did not offer any final resolution. With heavy hearts and minds burdened by the inexplicable events, we sealed off the mansion and reported our findings to the authorities, as best we could. In the cold light of dawn, as the first rays of the sun began to chase away the darkness, the mansion receded into the distance, a bleak silhouette against a pale sky. I returned to my cruiser, still reeling from the weight of the experiences that had unfolded within those cursed walls. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the spectral figures at the windows and hear the echo of those haunted voices. That night had not only shaken my faith in rationality, but had also left an indelible mark on my soul, a mark that would haunt me in the quiet moments long after the call of duty had faded into memory. The drive back from that night was spent in a haze of introspection and raw emotion. The city was beginning to stir as dawn broke over Burlington, its familiar streets now tainted by the residue of something inexplicable. I could hear the hum of early traffic and the distant call of another officer. Yet all of these everyday sounds seemed jarringly out of place after the oppressive silence of the mansion. My mind raced with questions that no one back at the station could answer. What force had driven those figures to haunt the windows? What inhuman sorrow lay buried within those walls? I knew that I had seen something that defied common explanation, something that muddled the clear lines between duty, fear, and despair. Over the following days, I found myself rewatching the events of that night over and over in my mind. Every creak of the mansion's aging wood, every murmur of the wind against shattered glass, and every fleeting glimpse of a spectral face would return unbidden in my thoughts. I began to experience moments of crippling anxiety during the quiet lulls of a shift, moments when the voices of the past seemed to speak directly to me. In the solitude of my apartment, the journal we had recovered became a focal point for my obsession. I spent long hours poring over its cryptic entries, trying to understand a narrative that was as fragmented as it was chilling. The more I read, the more I began to question everything I had taken for granted about the nature of reality. The rational world I had built as a police officer was crumbling, replaced by a nightmarish tableau where the line between the physical and the metaphysical had become indistinguishable. Sleep, once a refuge, turned into a battleground of relentless nightmares. Dreams of the mansion, a place of endless corridors, anguished whispers, and phantom silhouettes, invaded my every rest. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding as if trying to escape the confines of my chest. And for a fleeting moment I was back in those oppressive halls. Each nightmare left me more exhausted and disoriented, and soon I began to dread the return to duty, fearing that the horrors of that night might seep into my everyday reality. I found solace, if only for a short time, in the routine of my work, but even in the midst of seemingly normal calls, I could feel the ghostly residue of that cursed night. Each patrol drive reminded me of the mansion's looming presence in the recesses of my mind, a reminder that certain horrors cannot be simply left behind once encountered. My colleagues noticed the change in me. There were hushed whispers in the break room, furtive glances exchanged as I absent-mindedly checked my sidearm, and a persistent question in their eyes. Had I seen something I shouldn't have? I tried to answer with vague nods and a rehearsed smile, but deep down I knew the truth was far more unsettling. Over time, the mansion's influence seeped into the very fabric of my existence. I began to experience brief episodes of disorientation where time seemed to halt, and the mundane became interlaced with an undercurrent of dread. In the quiet lull between calls, I questioned if I was losing touch with reality. These moments, filled with a paralyzing sense of isolation, left me teetering on the brink of a psychological fracture. A fracture that threatened to expose me to the abyss lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. In the midst of all this inner turmoil, one particular incident forced me to confront the potential consequences of my experiences. A routine traffic stop on a rainy evening escalated in a way I could never have anticipated. The suspect, a troubled young man with haunted eyes, claimed he was running from something, a presence that he said was relentlessly pursuing him. His words, barely more than a frantic whisper, echoed the sentiment I had been battling internally for weeks. I tried to remain professional, but as I escorted him to the patrol car, the overlap between my own experiences and his frantic narrative became uncomfortably apparent. Had the mansion left an indelible mark on not just me, but on those who inadvertently brushed its malignant aura? The idea unsettled me deeply, planting a seed of doubt about the nature of evil and the unseen forces that might be influencing our lives. Returning to the station that night, I took solace in the routine of filing reports and confiding in a few trusted colleagues. Yet, every detail I recorded about the mansion felt inadequate. A half-truth, a mere snapshot of a horror that defied logical explanation. I sat in my small, cramped office long after most had gone home, reviewing the audio recordings of my radio communications, trying to catch any nuance that might hint at an explanation. The static of the broadcast, the brief pauses, even the strained cadence of my own voice. All of these elements merged into a disquieting symphony that left me questioning the reality of what had transpired. I knew that the memory of that night would never fully fade, that it would continue to linger like a persistent shadow, challenging my perceptions and my understanding of the world. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the haunting memories refused to yield to the light of normalcy, I found myself increasingly isolated by the burden of what I had experienced. Every call, every quiet moment on patrol, carried echoes of the mansion's sorrowful lament. A reminder that once you've gazed into the abyss, it's impossible to completely turn away from its stare. The building remained there in my recollections, not as a physical structure but as a symbol of all the unresolved horrors and unanswered questions that life sometimes presents without warning. Even as I tried to put the events behind me and focus on the routine of duty, a nagging sensation persisted. A truth too terrible to face, a reality too obscure to ignore. I often wonder if the mansion was merely a physical location or if it was, in fact, a manifestation of every dark secret and suppressed emotion that had ever been part of Burlington's troubled history. The unanswered questions gnawed at me with a relentless ferocity. Questions about the boundaries between life and death, the tangible and the intangible, the known and the unfathomable. The experiences of that cursed night and the subsequent unraveling of my inner world have left me scarred, forever entangled in a web of memories that refuse to let go. I continue to carry those images with me, like ghosts in the recesses of my mind, a constant reminder that some horrors remain even after the night has ended. Even now, as I write these words in the quiet solitude of a late shift, I feel the weight of that night pressing upon me. The darkness is never far behind, and the silence is always pregnant with the possibility of something just beyond the threshold of understanding. I ask myself, are we ever truly free from the shadows that cling to our souls, or do they follow us like silent specters, waiting for the next moment when we dare to look away? With that thought, the memory of the mansion settles in, a lingering, unsettling presence that challenges everything I once believed to be real. The aftermath of that night had become a part of me, a slow, burning ember of dread that could reignite at any moment, no matter how far I tried to run. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself increasingly haunted by visions of the mansion's dark corridors in moments of inattentiveness, a reflection of my own inner turmoil. Every new case I worked seemed to echo fragments of that fateful night, as if the boundaries between past and present, reality and nightmare, had irreparably blurred. I questioned whether the horrors I witnessed were confined solely to that dilapidated structure, or if they were symptomatic of something deeper, a malignant force that had invaded the very fabric of our existence and now taunted me with its intangible presence. Late one stormy evening, while on a routine call in a quiet residential area far from Burlington's troubled streets, I received another call on my radio. The voice on the other end was distorted, barely comprehensible, but the urgency was unmistakable. A plea for help in a location not far from the heart of the city. Despite my weariness, I couldn't ignore the desperate tone that resonated through the static. I was compelled, by both duty and an inexplicable pull towards the unknown, to respond. The call led me to an old, run-down apartment building that stood as a stark contrast to the manicured neighborhoods I had grown accustomed to patrolling. In the dimly lit corridor of that building, as rain pounded on the uneven pavement outside, I felt that same lingering dread, the haunting echo of the mansion's oppressive aura creeping into a new setting. Inside the apartment, I encountered a resident who was visibly shaken. A middle-aged woman with haunted eyes and a voice that trembled with grief and terror. "They won't leave me alone," she whispered, barely audible over the sound of the storm. Her words, fragile and raw, dredged up memories of that cursed night. I listened as she recounted inexplicable occurrences, strange shadows in the corners of her vision, unnerving footsteps in the dead of night, and the chilling sound of whispered cries that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. As I took her statement, my mind involuntarily wandered back to the spectral figures at the windows of the McNeil mansion, and I couldn't shake the feeling that some unseen, malevolent force was at play, a force that transcended the boundaries of individual places and seeped into the hearts of those touched by its insidious presence. Driving away from the apartment building, I replayed her words over and over, each syllable deepening my uncertainty about the nature of evil. The case was closed with routine formality, but the residue of that encounter lingered like a specter, blurring the lines between my professional responsibilities and the personal torment that had taken root within me. In the following days, similar reports began to trickle in from different corners of the city, accounts of inexplicable phenomena that defied logical explanation. The pattern was unmistakable. Haunted eyes, trembling voices, and overwhelming sensations of despair had become recurring themes in the cases that landed on my desk. No longer could I treat these incidents as isolated events of urban legend or hysterical overreactions. They formed part of a larger tapestry, a tapestry woven with threads of fear, loss, and an inexplicable darkness that seemed to have awakened in the wake of that night at the mansion. I found myself reaching out to colleagues who had long retired or moved on, searching for any clue that might unravel the mystery of these shared nightmares. Late-night conversations in dimly lit diners and hushed exchanges in the back rooms of the station gradually revealed a disturbing commonality. Many had encountered experiences that defied easy explanation. A momentary glimpse of a figure in the mirror, a door opening by itself, or a feeling of being watched by something unseen. As these accounts accumulated, it became clear that the darkness was not confined to the boundaries of the abandoned mansion, but was instead part of a pervasive, unspeakable force that lurked just beyond the edges of our lives. I began to compile everything: the journal entries, the faded photographs, the whispered testimonies, in a quest to understand if I was witnessing a singular anomaly or a manifestation of a broader, insidious curse. The more I delved into the history of Burlington, the more I discovered hidden narratives of despair, of personal tragedies swept under the rug by time and denial. Even the seemingly mundane records of property disputes and local disappearances hinted at an undercurrent of something unexplainable, a dark legacy that stretched back generations, manifesting in inexplicable ways and tormenting those who dared to live in its shadow. Every revelation only deepened the mystery, and every unanswered question festered like a wound that refused to heal. The mansion and the experiences that followed it had become emblematic of a broader, haunting uncertainty. A living reminder that the darkness we sometimes dismiss as fantasy might, in fact, be an integral part of our reality. In the suffocating pressure of sleepless nights and tireless investigations, I sometimes caught myself wondering if I would ever find the answers I sought. The cumulative weight of these mysteries began to distort my perception of time and space, blurring the line between the tangible and the ineffable. I recall one night, as I sat in my car parked in a deserted lot, the engine idling softly and the rain tapping a steady rhythm on the windshield. I found myself whispering a question to the empty darkness. What if the true horror isn't just the unknown, but the knowledge that some things were never meant to be understood? In that moment, the storm outside seemed to echo the tumult inside me, an endless, unyielding barrage of raindrops and heartbeats that left me suspended between despair and reluctant acceptance. Now, as I continue to navigate the murky intersection of duty and the inexplicable, I am left with a lingering, unshakable question. Are we merely pawns in a narrative woven by forces beyond our comprehension? Or can we truly ever escape the legacy of darkness that binds us? Even as I file my reports, and even as I hope for the dawn to banish the specters of the night, I cannot silence the whisper of that question. A question that may never find a satisfactory answer, and one that, like the mansion, will forever haunt the corridors of my mind. It has been months since that fateful night, yet the memories continue to twist through my days like an inescapable maze. Every time I step into my patrol car, I feel a familiar chill, a reminder that the darkness is always just a heartbeat away. I started noticing small, inexplicable incidents around Burlington that mirrored the eerie occurrences of that long-ago evening. Streetlights that would flicker erratically in response to no apparent malfunction. Security cameras that captured fleeting images of indistinct figures in peripheral vision, and the occasional unaccounted-for drop in temperature that left me reaching for my jacket in the middle of summer. The city's history, as I soon discovered, was steeped in whispered legends of unexplained tragedies and unsettling coincidences that defied reason. Over time, I pieced together accounts from local residents whose lives had been touched by a pervasive sense of foreboding. A retired schoolteacher spoke of an attic that would glow with a ghostly light long after the power was cut off. A young mechanic recounted a story about a long-forgotten building that once housed a community center, and which, on stormy nights, seemed to breathe with an eerie, unstoppable rhythm. Each story, though different in its specifics, resonated with that same core of inexplicable terror, a terror that refused to be confined to old buildings and obsolete urban legends. Determined to unearth the source of these strange happenings, I returned to the mansion one cold, rain-sodden evening. I had long stopped relying solely on backup or the comfort of a team. There was something intensely personal about confronting that darkness alone. The drive back was marked by a relentless drizzle that blurred the neon reflections of passing streetlights, a disorienting mix of past and present that set my mind on edge. Parking across the abandoned mansion, I took a deep breath and stepped out into the persistent rain. The building loomed before me, its battered facade and shattered windows a stark testament to time's cruelty. Yet, beneath its decay, I could sense a disturbing persistence, a will to exist that defied natural order. I approached the broken entrance, and with a deliberate push, I crossed the threshold into that realm of lingering sorrows. Inside, the mansion was quieter than I remembered, yet every step I took was filled with the oppressive silence of unspoken memories. I retraced the corridors and rooms that had once filled me with a suffocating dread, but now I searched for clues, anything that might explain the inexplicable. The abandoned study, with its faded portraits and scattered documents, yielded little more than a series of cryptic notations scrawled on yellowed paper. These notes spoke of secret meetings, hidden truths, and a presence that had woven itself into the very fabric of the mansion's history. The more I looked, the more I began to feel that I was stepping into a narrative not of mere trespass, but of ritual and punishment, a dark communion between the living and the damned. Somewhere deep within the mansion's labyrinthine recesses, I sensed that the answers lay hidden, waiting for someone brave or perhaps foolish enough to uncover them. In one particular room, barely lit by a single weak bulb suspended from the ceiling, I found what appeared to be a makeshift altar, a collection of personal items arranged with an almost obsessive precision. Photographs, candles, and mysterious symbols scrawled on torn pieces of cloth lay in a chaotic yet deliberate order. The atmosphere in that room was suffused with a melancholy that bordered on reverence, as if the place were hallowed ground for those who had suffered unspeakable losses. As I knelt to examine one of the photographs, I noticed that the faces in the image, though blurred by age, bore an uncanny resemblance to those in the journal I had studied. A surge of recognition, mingled with an acute sense of dread, coursed through me. I realized, with a chilling certainty, that the line between the personal tragedies of the past and my own creeping disillusionment was perilously thin. The mansion was not simply a building, it was a repository of human sorrow, etched in every stone, every splintered beam. I left the room with more questions than answers. The building seemed to exhale a heavy, mournful sigh as I passed, as though it were relieved and yet pained to have its secrets momentarily disturbed. The corridors led me inexorably to a long-forgotten wing of the mansion where the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay was almost tangible. In that forgotten enclave, I stumbled upon a series of locked doors. One door, in particular, drew me in with an inexplicable pull. With some effort, I managed to force it open, revealing a small, windowless cell lined with rusted metal bars. Inside, the remnants of a life: a child's drawing, a weathered blanket, a discarded toy, spoke of innocence lost to the relentless march of time and sorrow. Standing there, I felt as if I were peering into the abyss of a haunted past, one that demanded acknowledgement and reverence. I pressed my palm against the cold bars, and, in that solitary moment, silently vowed to uncover the truth behind the darkness that had come to define not only the mansion, but the very heart of Burlington itself. The deeper I ventured into the mansion, the more the oppressive force seemed to wrap around me, a tangible reminder that some evils persist long after they have been consigned to memory. I began to question my own perceptions, wondering if the horrifying incidents I had witnessed were mere manifestations of grief and isolation, or if they were evidence of something altogether more sinister. The corridors blurred, time dilated, and for a moment I lost all sense of direction, caught in a maelstrom of past and present colliding in a symphony of despair. In that fragmented state, I experienced a profound emotional breakdown, a shattering realization that perhaps my pursuit of truth was an act of futile defiance against forces that were beyond human control. I staggered back into the main hall, my mind reeling with the enormity of what I was confronting. The mansion, with its dark legacy and unyielding sorrow, had become an inescapable mirror reflecting the deepest recesses of my own soul. Now, as I stand at the threshold of understanding and oblivion, I cannot help but question whether the mansion's hauntings are a curse upon its occupants or a mirror of the human condition, a relentless cycle of pain, memory, and the inescapable specter of the past. In the dead of night, while the rain falls unceasingly and the city sleeps unaware, I continue to chase the elusive truth, even as I wonder if some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The darkness, it seems, is a constant companion, a silent witness to every moment of despair and every spark of hope. And in this ceaseless struggle against the encroaching shadows, I am left with one burning, unresolved question. If the past is never truly gone, then what hope remains for those of us trying to find solace in the present? I sat in the driver's seat of my cruiser, the hum of the engine barely masking the eerie silence that had settled over these back roads in northern Indiana. The chill of a late autumn night seeped through the gaps in my worn leather jacket as I drove slowly past clusters of leafless trees and dilapidated farmhouses. Every passing mile deepened the uneasy feeling gnawing at me, a sensation that this night, like many before, was about to peel back layers of the familiar and expose something raw, something unseen. I had been a police officer for over 2 decades now, and yet no amount of experience had ever fully prepared me for the quiet dread that sometimes laced the night air. The radio crackled intermittently with routine dispatch calls and the static musings of colleagues, but nothing signaled the storm of events that was about to unravel. A call came through then, a terse, halting voice over the radio that announced a disturbance at a weathered homestead off a narrow county road. The address was hardly marked on any modern map, and the tone of the dispatch left little room for doubt. Backup was needed immediately. I recalled the frayed edges of my training, every cautionary tale about how even the most mundane-looking homes could hide sinister secrets. As I pulled my cruiser over on the side of the narrow road, my senses went hyper-aware. The distant rustling of wind through dead branches, the faint murmur of insects, and the low, almost imperceptible hum of something mechanical nearby all seemed to conspire in a foreboding symphony. Exiting the car, I adjusted the strap of my duty belt and took a deep breath. Every movement felt deliberate, honed by years on patrol. I walked toward the residence with measured steps, my boots crunching on uneven gravel. The house loomed ahead, a decrepit 2-story structure with peeling paint and windows that looked like vacant eyes. The streetlight's weak beam barely penetrated the darkness around it, leaving long, distorted shadows that stretched across the overgrown lawn. I listened, alert to any sound that might betray a presence within, yet found only the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the soft moan of the wind. Approaching the rickety front door, I radioed for my partner before calling out, my voice steady. "Officer Daniels, state your name and come out." There was no immediate answer, only the sound of distant dripping water that seemed amplified in the silence. I could almost feel the weight of the night pressing down, as though the very atmosphere anticipated what was to come. My pulse quickened, not with fear alone, but with a heightened sense of duty that came from knowing that every second counted in these situations. I pushed the door gently, half expecting it to creak under my touch, but instead it swung open with an eerie quietness that set my instincts ablaze. Inside, the corridor was a study in decay, old wallpaper peeling at the edges, the stain of countless years on floorboards that creaked under my weight, and a stale odor of damp rot mixed with something metallic that I could not immediately place. As I stepped further in, a faint, deliberate tapping sound reached my ears, a rhythmic, almost taunting percussion that made my skin crawl. It came from somewhere deeper within the house, likely from a room where the light of a dying bulb fought a losing battle against the encroaching dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if the very walls bore witness to secrets untold. The house seemed to breathe around me, and every narrow step carried the heavy possibility of confrontation. I reached the base of a creaking staircase and paused, listening for any indication of movement above. The silence was oppressive, and in its void, memories of long-forgotten cases and near misses surfaced unbidden. I recalled an old case in a neighboring town where fear had taken human form, an incident that left scars not just on those involved, but on the collective soul of our small police force. Tonight, as I pressed forward, that memory mingled with the palpable tension of the present. A sudden, muffled shout from upstairs pierced the quiet, followed by a sound that resembled hurried footsteps. My hand instinctively moved toward the holster on my hip, and I signaled over the radio that I was moving in for an upgrade in security. Every nerve in my body seemed poised for the moment when the familiar morbid scenarios of a troubled night would become violently real. I pushed open a door that led into a narrow hallway, its feeble illumination from a single flickering bulb casting bizarre shapes on the walls. There, in a room lined with dusty furniture and an unsettling stillness, I caught the glint of something that made me freeze mid-step. A cold, unyielding stare from behind a partially closed door. Before I could process the sight, the figure behind the door stepped forward. A woman, her eyes wild and unblinking, held a long, gleaming knife in one hand. Her presence was surreal, an almost spectral manifestation that defied logic. "Stay back!" she spat with a voice that trembled between wrath and despair. My training kicked in immediately as I shouted a warning, urging her to lower the weapon and come out peacefully. Her silence was as damning as any roar of defiance. It was in that moment, with the tension mounting and the staccato beat of my heart drowning out all thoughts, that I realized this night would be etched into my memory in a way I could not have imagined. I backed away slowly, my partner's voice over the radio urging caution as the situation escalated. The woman's eyes, dark and haunted, seemed to convey a history of suffering too deep to articulate. The flickering light caught on the blade of her knife, sending tiny shards of reflected light dancing on the wall, each glimmer a harbinger of the violence that was about to erupt. Her stance was defiant and desperate, two states merging into one in a deadly dance of possible outcomes. In that charged moment, I knew that the night had already taken a path from which there was no turning back. Every detail, the creak of the floor, the metallic scent in the cold air, my own controlled yet racing heartbeat, became a part of the memory that would haunt me for years to come. I recalled the words of my mentor from long ago. Every call is a story. Some end in closure, others end in scars. That night, as the echoes of my steps and the silent pleas of an unseen world converged, I felt the weight of that truth. I called for backup once again, each word laced with the urgent reality that this situation was spiraling into something no routine protocol could contain. Minutes that stretched into an eternity passed as I waited, every sound a possible harbinger of doom. When the silence was finally broken by the rapid approach of reinforcements, I took one last sweeping look at the unforgiving gloom of the decaying home. My instincts told me that behind those haunted eyes lay a story of despair, a narrative that would blend the lines between victim and perpetrator in the deepest, most troubling manner. With reluctant steps, I continued forward, carrying within me the premonition that nothing on that night's patrol would ever be the same again. The tension that had been building in that oppressive foyer finally exploded into chaos. As my fellow officers swept into the room, I couldn't shake the image of the woman's unblinking eyes, a gaze that had promised nothing but a destructive end to a lingering nightmare. The once faint tapping had now morphed into a cacophony, interlaced with the staccato commands and measured footsteps of officers moving as one unit, all while the dark secrets of the building seemed to conspire with fate. In the charged air, the figures moved methodically. I found myself locked in an internal battle, my training contending with the primal urge to flee, all while the weight of a responsibility heavier than any uniform pressed upon my shoulders. Officers shouted commands, their voices echoing in the narrow hallways like fragments of a broken promise. "Hands up! Don't make this worse!" one of them bellowed as the situation teetered on the brink of violence. Despite the command, silence and stubborn resilience reigned on the other side of the threshold. Then, without warning, the woman surged forward from the dim corridor. In a blur of motion too swift to catch clearly, she barreled toward us, her eyes locked on me with a ferocity that froze my thoughts. Time seemed to shrink, and in that heartbeat of horror my world contracted to the searing pain of metal cutting through flesh. I felt the impact as if it were a thunderclap in slow motion, a precise blow to my chest that radiated white-hot agony. My body recoiled instinctively, every fiber screaming in protest as the knife found its mark. "Officer, get down!" someone shouted, though the words came muted against the roaring storm of adrenaline and pain that now consumed me. I tried to steady myself, to take a controlled breath, but the shock of the attack drowned out all rational thought. Marcus's voice was the only tether to sanity, urging, "Reed, hold on. We've got you." I could hear his footfalls echoing on the tiled floor as fellow officers moved in with desperate efficiency. In the ensuing pandemonium, the space around me became a confused tapestry of flashing lights, muffled shouts, and the overwhelming scent of fear. I struggled to maintain focus even as the edges of my vision blurred, the reality of every moment colliding into a chaotic rush. The metallic taste of blood mingled with the bitter tang of fear as I tried to comprehend the surreal horror of the attacker's expression, a blend of torment, resolve, and something inhuman that defied explanation. The woman, still advancing with a relentless determination, gave no sign of relenting. Each step she took was punctuated by a grotesque sense of purpose, as if the knife in her hand was less a weapon and more a twisted extension of her own fractured soul. Marcus's firm, unyielding grip on my arm pulled me away from the immediate line of fire as shots rang out in rapid succession. The echo of the gunshots reverberated off the bare walls, and the air was split by the sharp retort of weaponry. In the midst of the discord, I heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass and splintering wood, a violent punctuation marking the collapse of order into chaos. I could feel the sting of each bullet's impact, even as the barrage of external stimuli left me hovering between lucidity and an all-encompassing daze. Amid the turmoil, I clung to every ounce of training, every protocol ingrained in me since the earliest days of my career. I fought to piece together the events with the clarity of a seasoned officer, even as my body writhed in pain. My mind, normally a reservoir of precise, calculated responses, now felt like a jumbled reel of fragmented memories. The flashing silhouette of a foe, the anguished cry of a fallen colleague, the persistent, inexplicable tapping that had heralded this confrontation from the very beginning. In that inferno of uncertainty, every second was a battle against an enemy who was as unpredictable as he was merciless. It was in that surreal moment, with adrenaline surging and the world oscillating between an intimate closeness and an inescapable void, that I distinctly heard a whispered plea, a sound so subtle that I almost mistook it for the mere rustling of paper in the wind. The voice was fragile, yet laden with desperation, a plea that hinted at regret and a lifetime of unspoken sorrow. For an agonizing moment, I questioned whether that sound belonged to the attacker, or if it was simply the ghost of something lost in the corridors of my own haunted memories. Before any reconciliation of these disjointed images could occur, the chaos reached its climax. With a final, desperate burst, a fellow officer discharged their weapon, and the relentless assault came to an abrupt halt. The attacker crumpled to the ground in a final, shuddering collapse, her knife skittering across the cold tile floor. In the heavy silence that followed, punctuated only by my ragged breathing and the distant, faltering beats of heart monitors, the gravity of the night's events settled like a suffocating shroud around us all. Every detail, the searing pain in my chest, the disjointed echoes of commands, the surreal quiet that succeeded the storm of violence, wove itself into an indelible scar on my memory. As I lay there, struggling to orient myself in a reality now forever altered by that brutal encounter, the world outside the shattered windows seemed to carry on as if nothing had happened. but deep within, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I could only cling to the hope that the wound, though physically treatable, would someday mend in ways my heart and soul might understand. The sterile brightness of the hospital corridors was a harsh counterpoint to the darkness of that night. In the dim hum of fluorescent lights and the incessant beeping of monitors, I lay confined to a narrow gurney, the taste of metal and antiseptic mingling in my mouth. The paramedics worked tirelessly around me, their voices measured and clinical, as if reciting a well-rehearsed script. Every incision, every suture was executed with the precision of a ritual meant to honor life and stave off the relentless encroachment of death. Yet, as I drifted in and out of consciousness, the surreal fragments of that violent encounter refused to fade, their persistence a taunt from a night that seemed to exist on the edge of nightmares and reality. I recall the moment vividly. The steady murmur of the doctor as he informed me that the wound, though severe, hadn't struck any vital organs. "You're lucky, Officer Reed," he had said, his voice flat yet laced with the unspoken gravity of the situation. The knife missed something critical. Those words, meant to console, instead resonated with a hollow echo in the cavern of my thoughts. Luck, I mused, was a fickle mistress, and in that instant, I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or cursed. The juxtaposition of professional detachment against the raw tapestry of my pain created a dissonance that was hard to reconcile. I could still feel the hot sting of the blade, the echo of the attacker's eyes, and the unsettling permanence of the memory that had etched itself into my skin and soul. In the hours that followed, as the hospital's steady routine continued around me, I found solace only in the soft murmurs of my own labored breaths and the distant, rhythmic lullaby of the night outside. I drifted in a limbo between wakefulness and dreams, where the events of that night would replay in endless loops, a macabre movie on a loop that refused to end. Each time I stirred, the vivid images of the decaying homestead, the woman's desperate gaze, and the disjointed fragments of chaos crashed over me like relentless waves. I began to question the nature of memory and reality. Were these images the product of a damaged mind clinging to its last vestiges of order, or were they brutally real events seared into my consciousness? Night after night, the hospital room transformed from a sanctuary into a prison of my own recollections. Sleep proved elusive, and as I lay on that narrow bed with the sterile sheets tangled around my limbs, I would awaken to find the room darkened by the early pre-dawn gloom and the haunting remnants of my own terror. Unseen forces seemed to lurk in the corners of my vision, and every creak, every whisper of the wind against the window pane set my heart racing. The physical pain in my chest, though manageable, was eclipsed by the psychological burden that was steadily taking root. An insidious dread that there were parts of that night I couldn't fully grasp, fragments that defied explanation. In whispered conversations during the rare moments of quiet between the bustling doctors and the routine rounds of the night nurse, I learned snippets about my assailant. Her name, I discovered, was Talia, and she was more than just a troubled soul in the eyes of the community. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of her descent into isolation, of a life burdened by repeated evictions and a history marred by personal tragedy. She was a name that, in the annals of local folklore, carried a grim significance. Yet, even as the investigations began and questions were hastily raised about her motives and her fractured mental state, the memory of our encounter remained unyielding, a testament to the unpredictable dance between order and chaos that defines this line of work. I spent long hours grappling with the unspoken question: what drives a person to the brink of violence? To wield a knife as though it were the sole means of exorcising demons? In the sterile solitude of that hospital room, with the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, I found myself revisiting not only that fateful confrontation, but also the accumulated weight of years spent on the thin line between normalcy and the macabre. Every case, every call, had brought with it a subtle erosion of certainty, a gradual, almost imperceptible shift towards a world where every shadow might conceal a threat, every stranger might harbor a hidden despair. And on that night, that erosion manifested itself in the raw, undeniable horror of Talia's eyes, an expression that seemed to ask as much as it condemned. It was in the midst of these reflective hours that a new dread began to take root. At first, it was a nameless anxiety, an almost paranoid suspicion that the events of that night were not isolated, that something larger was at play. I found scraps of evidence in my own thoughts, a fleeting memory of an unaccounted-for sound, a shadow that didn't belong, the inexplicable feeling that the darkness had not relinquished its hold even as daylight crept in. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the world outside was still shrouded in sleep, I could almost swear I heard a voice, a soft, desperate whisper that seemed to come from the very depths of the room. "You're not done yet," it murmured, so faint that I questioned my sanity upon hearing it. The question haunted me long after the doctor's assurances and the routine of hospital life resumed. I knew that, despite the physical wound healing, the deeper, more insidious injury lay in the corners of my mind, in the unresolved echoes of a night that refused to be consigned to the annals of time. With every passing hour, I felt that the ghost of that encounter was not confined to the decaying homestead or to my shattered memory. It had seeped into my very existence, blurring the boundaries between the tangible and the spectral. Returning to duty after my release from the hospital was an exercise in walking on a knife's edge. Every step measured, every glance laced with the residue of fear. In the weeks that followed, I resumed my routine patrols across the quiet neighborhoods and windswept country roads of our county. Yet, despite the outward appearance of normalcy, I found that the residue of that fateful night clung stubbornly to my every movement. The familiar rhythms of traffic reports, radio chatter, and mundane calls for service now resonated in my ears, as echoing reminders of a singular moment where the fragile veil between order and chaos had been irrevocably pierced. My partner, Officer Daniels, noticed the shift in me immediately. His concerned eyes often met mine during long, silent drives, and in the brief pauses of conversation that punctuated our patrols, he would remark, "Something's off, Reed. You've been distant, like you're still back there in that house." His words, spoken softly over the din of the cruiser's engine and the quiet rustle of passing trees, would remind me of the duality of our profession. We were tasked with protecting others while constantly grappling with the ghosts of our own burdens. I told him that I was fine, that it was just the aftermath of a bad call, but deep down I knew that the darkness of that night had seeped into my bones, a slow, creeping despair that no amount of routine could entirely exorcise. Night shifts grew increasingly difficult. I would find myself staring blankly at the dashboard, my thoughts drifting to that night like so many faded photographs. In every quiet intersection, in every solitary street corner, I sensed an echo of the terror that had nearly claimed me. The sights and sounds of everyday life, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the soft murmur of a television from a neighbor's window, were now interwoven with the memories of shattered glass, echoing footsteps, and the spectral whisper that had haunted the hospital room. I began to question my instincts, wondering if my mind was playing cruel tricks on me, or if there truly was an unseen force lurking at the periphery of my vision. During one particularly long night, after hours of monotonous patrol, I found myself drawn to the outskirts of the town, where abandoned warehouses and decaying barns stood as silent sentinels of a bygone era. The moon, nearly full, cast a ghostly glow upon the landscape, illuminating eerie silhouettes and deepening the intensity of every shadow. As I walked the deserted streets, I recalled the soft tapping sound from that decaying homestead, the rhythm that now echoed within my skull like a persistent metronome of doom. In that solitude, every creak of a rusted hinge or distant rustle in the undergrowth sent jolts of anxiety through me. I questioned whether the darkness itself harbored a will, a malignant force that sought to claim not just physical life, but the very essence of hope. One night, while standing at a desolate intersection, I found a small, neatly folded note tucked under the windshield wiper of my cruiser. The paper was aged and creased, and upon it, in careful, unyielding handwriting, were the words, "Tonight, you nearly closed the door on me, but some doors are meant to remain open." The message struck me with a force that went beyond mere words. It was as if my deepest fears had been externalized into ink and paper, a reminder that some horrors were not easily confined to a single moment or place. I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity, the weight of its implications settling heavily in my heart. Who had written it? Was it Talia, the woman whose sorrow had culminated in violence? Or was it someone, or something, else altogether, intent on luring me back into a labyrinth of unresolved terror? That question gnawed at me, its answer as elusive as the flicker of a dying flame. In the days that followed, I immersed myself in gathering every scrap of information I could about the incident. I revisited the scene with colleagues, re-interviewed witnesses, and pored over every detail that might illuminate the dark corners of that night. The investigation, however, seemed to mirror the labyrinthine nature of my own thoughts. Each new clue led to more questions than answers. There were whispers among the locals about a history of strange occurrences in the area, a legacy of grief, loss, and perhaps something more sinister that lay buried beneath layers of time and neglect. These murmurs, though unverified, only deepened the unsettling feeling that the attack was not an isolated incident, but a fragment of a larger, more disturbing tapestry. I began to document my experiences meticulously, not just as a report for my superiors, but as a means of exercising the persistent memories that haunted me day after day. Late at night, I would sit at my small desk in the precinct, the harsh glare of a desk lamp illuminating my notes, and write down every detail I could recall. The cold flash of metal, the sound of orders shouted in desperation, the feeling of my heart pounding in a quiet room that suddenly felt infinitely small. The words flowed from me like a confession, each sentence an attempt to reconcile the divide between the man who served on the front lines and the one who was now under siege by his own memories. Yet, amidst the clinical examination of facts and figures, a sense of dread continued to pervade my thoughts. There were moments, in the quiet solitude after a long shift, when I would wonder if I was being followed. A soft shuffle in the back of my mind that left me glancing nervously over my shoulder, even in the safety of my home. The boundaries between duty and obsession blurred, and I realized with a sickening certainty that the scars left that night were not merely physical, but psychological. I was trapped in a relentless cycle of doubt and despair, tormented by the knowledge that some doors, once opened, could never be entirely closed. In the weeks that bled into months, the investigation took on an almost surreal quality, a descent into a labyrinth of unanswered questions and uncanny coincidences. My fellow officers, though professional in their duties, could not entirely mask their own unease as whispers of the case spread through the precinct. In quiet corners of the break room, over cups of lukewarm coffee, they would exchange furtive glances and subdued comments about the mysterious note and the unsettling aura that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. I, too, found myself increasingly isolated by the burden of the night's events, a solitary figure wrestling with shadows, both real and imagined. Late one autumn evening, I was called out once more, a seemingly routine call from a rural farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The address was remote, the kind of place that, when abandoned by time, could easily become the backdrop for the most outlandish of nightmares. As I drove the winding roads flanked by fields now barren under the weight of winter's approach, I felt the resurgence of that familiar dread. The radio dispatch was garbled, the voice of the caller trembling with uncertainty. Upon arrival, the farmhouse loomed in the twilight like a relic from a forgotten past, its once proud structure now a decaying monument to neglect and solitude. I approached the building cautiously, my flashlight slicing through the encroaching darkness. Inside, every step stirred the dust of decades, and the silence was as thick as the layer of grime that covered every surface. I moved methodically, scanning each room for any sign of disturbance, my senses attuned to the slightest anomaly. It was in one of these barren rooms that I found an object that sent a chill coursing through me. A battered photograph of a young woman with eyes that bore a striking resemblance to those of Talia, the attacker from that fateful night. Her gaze in the photo was filled with a haunting mixture of despair and defiance, as if she too had been tormented by forces beyond her control. I carefully placed the photograph into evidence, each detail of the image etching itself into my mind. The farmhouse, it seemed, was more than just an abandoned relic. It was a repository of memories, of lives lived and lost. As I stood there, the wind outside rose in a mournful dirge that rattled the windows, and I couldn't help but feel that I had stumbled into yet another chapter of the same relentless mystery. Was it merely coincidence that Talia's face stared back at me from the faded print? Or was it a deliberate message left by someone who knew too much? The question burned in my chest, and despite my better judgment, I found that I couldn't let it go unanswered. Back at the precinct, I spent long hours poring over files and interviewing anyone who might remember something. A neighbor who had seen a figure lurking near the farmhouse, an old-timer whose recollections of the area reached back to times when the fields were fertile and hope was a frequent visitor. Each conversation, each snippet of recollection, added another layer to the puzzle. I began to see a pattern, a tapestry woven from seemingly disparate threads of sorrow, anger, and inexplicable connection. There were reports, sporadic, almost dismissible, of strange lights in the sky, eerie sounds coming from deserted fields, and cold spots in otherwise ordinary spaces. The threads were fragile, yet together they painted a picture too disturbing to ignore. A history of tragedy and inexplicable occurrences that spanned far beyond the boundaries of my usual patrol. I felt increasingly compelled to follow these leads myself, venturing into the dark hinterlands of our county after my shifts. Each nocturnal excursion was a journey into the unknown, a confrontation with memories and premonitions that I had long tried to bury beneath the monotony of duty. In the solitude of those long drives down forgotten roads, every rustle of the wind, every fleeting shadow cast by a distant tree, became a portent of something amiss. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and as I crossed the thresholds of abandoned fields and crumbling barns, I couldn't help but wonder if the darkness itself was calling to me, urging me to seek out its hidden truths. One rain-soaked night, as I sought refuge in an old diner on the outskirts of town, I encountered an elderly man who seemed to live on the fringes of a forgotten era. His eyes, clouded with the weight of countless years, glimmered with a strange intensity as he spoke of events that modern minds would deem impossible. He recounted tales of a spirit, a restless presence that roamed these lands, a specter born of sorrow and betrayal. With each carefully measured word, he painted a picture of a force that defied explanation, one that had been intertwined with the fates of those who dared to traverse these lonely roads. I listened, captivated despite myself, as he confessed that he had once seen a face in the darkness, a face that, with an almost spectral familiarity, resembled that of Talia. The man's words resonated with the echoes of my own experiences, blurring the line between folklore and reality. As I left that diner, the chill of his narrative clung to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that every shadow might be more than mere absence of light. In the silence of my car, with the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof, I felt a deep-seated compulsion to unravel the tangled threads of this mystery, no matter how painful or perilous the journey might become. Each piece of the puzzle, each lingering question seemed to point to a destiny that I had never imagined, a destiny intertwined with forces as old as the land itself, forces that defied the rational boundaries of a police officer's world. In the relentless pull of that unyielding investigation, I soon found that every step forward revealed yet another layer of dread. The more I delved into the enigma that had overtaken my thoughts, the more it became apparent that the boundaries between my personal trauma and the case were fatally intertwined. I began to experience moments of dislocation, a surreal fragmentation of time, where memories of that first violent encounter overlapped with the present. The face of Talia, the desperate plea in the hospital room, and the chilling message left on my cruiser coalesced into a single, unshakable truth. Something profound and disturbing was at work. Late one evening, while revisiting the farmhouse scene with a small team of detectives, I found myself alone with a single faded journal tucked away in a hidden compartment behind a rotting bookcase. The journal, its pages brittle and stained with the passage of time, belonged to a woman whose name was scrawled across the first page in elegant cursive: Marjorie. As I flipped through its contents, I discovered accounts of similar disturbances, of voices in the night and a persistent unseen despair that had plagued not only her, but generations before her. Her words were raw and unfiltered, detailing a descent into psychological torment that resonated disturbingly with my own memories. Marjorie wrote about inexplicable events, a persistent presence in the home, mysterious figures in the periphery of vision, and a relentless feeling of being watched. Her final entries spoke of an inevitable convergence of fate, a reckoning where past traumas and present horrors would collide. I couldn't help but feel that her life had been a mirror of my own disintegrating sanity, a tragic prelude to a fate I was desperately trying to avoid. The journal's revelations stirred something deep within me, a recognition of patterns that defied logic, yet demanded acknowledgement. The threads of her narrative wove themselves into the fabric of the mystery that had overtaken my every waking thought. Haunted by Marjorie's words and driven by an almost obsessive need for answers, I extended my inquiries beyond official channels. I reached out to community elders, piecing together a timeline that spanned decades, a legacy of inexplicable losses and shadows that lingered long after the events themselves had faded into local myth. The more I learned, the more I became convinced that the case was not confined to a single act of violence, but was part of a larger, more sinister cycle. The past, it seemed, had a way of clawing its way back into the present, manifesting in violent awakenings and spectral echoes that shattered any illusion of normalcy. My nights were filled with relentless pursuits of these elusive fragments, tranquil drives through mist-covered roads, furtive conversations in dimly lit diners, and clandestine meetings with those who claimed to have seen what most would dismiss as mere hallucinations. Every detail, no matter how trivial, became a potential piece of evidence in a puzzle that defied conventional understanding. It wasn't just about finding Talia or understanding her motives anymore. It was about peeling back layers of history, about confronting a legacy of despair that had haunted these lands for generations. As I trudged through long, lonely nights, sleep became a distant memory, replaced by an unyielding vigilance that gnawed at my sanity. I began to experience vivid flashbacks, the sudden sensation of cold breath on my neck as I sat in silence during traffic stops, the fleeting image of a weeping woman in a darkened alley, the soft, haunting cadence of a voice that whispered promises of retribution. Each of these moments, as disjointed as they might have been alone, converged to form a tapestry that mirrored the unrelenting nature of the night of the attack. The boundaries between past and present blurred, and every shadow took on a life of its own, a specter of unresolved pain that haunted my every step. In one particularly harrowing instance, I found myself alone on a storm-lashed night, patrolling a desolate section of the county. The heavy rain hammered against the windshield, and the wail of distant thunder played a grim accompaniment to the isolation that overwhelmed me. At a particularly dark intersection, my headlights caught a glimpse of a figure standing motionless at the edge of the road. For an agonizing moment, I felt the same familiar surge of dread, an inexplicable certainty that I was not witnessing a random passerby, but an echo from that fateful night. I stopped the cruiser, heart pounding in my chest, and stepped into the rain, each droplet a frozen shard of impending fate. When I reached the spot, the figure had vanished, leaving only the relentless patter of rain and the memory of something that I couldn't quite explain. That encounter, as fleeting as it was, became a turning point. It forced me to confront the terrifying possibility that the darkness I had been chasing wasn't contained to isolated events. It was an omnipresent force, an enigmatic presence that could manifest at any moment, anywhere. The more I struggled to understand, the more the lines between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving me with an unshakable unease. I found myself questioning not only the motives behind every shadow, but also my own sanity, a realization that the pursuit of truth often exacts a steep and painful toll. The investigation, now a labyrinth of personal torment and spectral evidence, continued to consume my thoughts. I felt as if I were caught in an endless loop, where every lead opened yet another door to a deeper, darker mystery. In the quiet recesses of my mind, the question echoed with maddening persistence. Would I ever be able to close the door on the past? Or was I condemned to forever wander the thin line between duty and the ghostly remnants of a haunted history? The uncertainties clawed at me relentlessly, a reminder that some enigmas remain unsolved, their answers as elusive as shadows fading with the dawn. As winter's grip slowly began to thaw into an uncertain spring, the relentless tide of unanswered questions and eerie memories culminated in a final confrontation that would forever redefine my understanding of duty, identity, and the specters that haunt us. I was called to a remote industrial complex on the outskirts of town, a place where abandoned factories and rusted machinery bore silent witness to decades of neglect and forgotten stories. The building stood isolated under a bruised sky, its broken windows and sagging roof forming a silhouette that was both defiant and mournful. The call was vague at first, a disturbance, an unexplained movement, a sense of foreboding that even the dispatcher struggled to articulate. But as I approached, every step toward the decaying edifice felt like a descent into the darkest recesses of my own soul. The compound was a maze of shadowed corridors and half-collapsed structures, a fitting stage for the final act of a tragedy that had been unfolding in my mind. I entered with my partner and a small team, our flashlights cutting erratically through the oppressive gloom. The beam of light revealed peeling paint, discarded remnants of machinery, and walls that seemed to weep with the condensation of long-kept secrets. There was an air of abandonment here, a sense that time itself had been exiled, leaving behind only the echoes of a tumultuous past. Our search led us deep into the heart of the complex, where the air grew heavy with decay and an almost tangible sorrow. In one cavernous room, amidst broken glass and rusted metal, I encountered a figure huddled in the shadows. For a split second, I believed it to be another victim of this forsaken place, a lone wanderer caught in a web of despair. The figure turned, revealing eyes that shimmered with the same haunted intensity I had witnessed on that violent night so long ago. It was a moment suspended in time, a collision of past and present. The figure's voice, barely a whisper, seemed to echo through the emptiness. "You're still here, Reed. You can't leave us behind." The words sent a shiver of recognition down my spine. Were these the ghostly echoes of those I had failed to save? Or was it a manifestation of my own tortured conscience, a specter born of unhealed wounds and relentless guilt? The air around me crackled with the intensity of unresolved pain as I stepped forward, each footfall an act of defiance against the invisible forces that sought to drag me back into the abyss. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice firm despite the trembling that threatened to betray my inner turmoil. But before an answer could form, the figure melted away into the darkness, leaving only a lingering chill and the faint imprint of despair that clung to the walls. My partner's concerned murmurs and the low hum of distant machinery were the only responses as we pressed deeper into the labyrinth. Every step felt like wading through a mire of memories. The stark flash of a knife, the agonized cry of a dying hope, the relentless ticking of a clock that measured moments of anguish more than time. I recalled Marjorie's final words, the obscure warnings embedded in the faded journal, and the ubiquitous specter of Talia's tortured gaze. Every detail converged into a singular, suffocating truth. The darkness was not an external enemy to be hunted down, but a fundamental part of our existence, a relentless mirror reflecting the shattered fragments of our humanity. In a final, desperate bid to confront the core of this nightmare, I found myself drawn to a narrow passageway that led to an abandoned control room. The walls were lined with obsolete monitors, dusty control panels, and a single battered phone that seemed to vibrate with echoes of lost voices. As I approached, the phone jerked to life, its shrill ring slicing through the oppressive silence. My hand, driven by both instinct and dread, reached out and answered. On the other end came a voice, soft, enigmatic, and eerily familiar. "You have opened the door, Officer Reed," it intoned, each syllable laden with a disquieting mixture of sorrow and malice. "There is no turning back." For a long, agonizing minute, the words reverberated in that desolate room, mingling with the creaks of the old building and the distant sound of running water. In that moment, every piece of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, and yet the overarching mystery only deepened. The voice continued, now more insistent. "What you witnessed, what you believe, is but a fragment of the whole truth. The door you have left ajar will never truly close. Its hinges are rusted with the sorrow and rage of those who have been forgotten." The phone clicked dead, leaving me cradling the weight of unanswered questions. A final, maddening twist that left my heart pounding and my spirit trembling in equal measure. I was patrolling the dim, fog-laden streets of Elk Grove on a night that seemed to absorb every scrap of warmth and comfort. The radio was silent save for sporadic static bursts, and the chill in the air was not just physical but seeped deep into my bones. It was just past 2 a.m. when a call came in about a disturbance at an old farmhouse on the outskirts, a place that had long been abandoned by time and memory. I drove slowly along the deserted road, the beam of my patrol car cutting through the thick mist that veiled everything in an eerie pall. As I neared the location, the dilapidated structure emerged from the fog like a specter of the past, its broken windows and sagging roof hinting at secrets best left undiscovered. I parked the car a safe distance away and stepped out into the cold night, the gravel crunching under my boots as I approached the creaking wooden porch. A broken light fixture swayed in the wind, casting grotesque shadows that danced over peeling paint and warped boards. Every sense was on alert. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the distant murmur of a stray dog and my own steady breathing. I reached the door and paused, listening to the weight of the silence. Then, suddenly, a scream tore through the stillness. A raw, anguished cry that seemed to vibrate in the very air around me. Without hesitation, I radioed for backup, my voice low and controlled despite the adrenaline surging in my veins, and then pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest as I stepped into a room where the stench of decay mingled with a metallic tang that I couldn't quite place, perhaps rust, perhaps something far more sinister. The beam of my flashlight skittered across the room, illuminating scattered debris, shattered glass, and the remnants of what once might have been cherished furniture. Every detail, from the water-stained wallpaper to the floorboards creaking under my weight, screamed neglect and abandonment. Yet something was disturbingly out of place. My instincts told me this was no ordinary break-in or random vandalism. The way the darkness clung to each corner, the unnerving quiet punctuated by muffled sounds, and the sudden, inexplicable chill that gripped me. It all conspired to create a sense of foreboding. Moving cautiously along the corridor, I noted the uneven patterns of light and shadow dancing on the walls, patterns that resembled the anxious heartbeat of the building itself. I edged toward a narrow staircase that led upward, each step a hesitant promise of what lay beyond. The sound of my footsteps became a metronome to my rising tension. As I ascended, the oppressive air thickened. It was as if the house itself was breathing, exhaling the despair of years long past. At the top of the stairs, I found a door slightly ajar, its soft creak merging with a faint, desperate whisper on the other side. Inside, the beam of my flashlight fell upon a scene that would forever be etched into my mind. A young woman sat bound to a rickety chair by a large, grimy window. Her wrists and ankles were secured with rough, unforgiving rope, and the fabric of her clothing was torn in places, as if she had struggled against her restraints. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with terror, and a rough cloth was tied around her mouth, a feeble attempt to stifle the sobs escaping in short, ragged gasps. "Help! Me!" she managed to croak, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I knelt beside her with a steady professionalism born of years on the force, cutting through the bindings with practiced precision while offering calm reassurances. In that moment, the farmhouse transformed from a mere abandoned relic to a stage for human suffering and desperate survival. Once freed, her eyes darted around wildly, fixating on shadows as if expecting the unseen monster to leap forth at any moment. She recounted, in broken fragments and trembling whispers, that a man from her past, a figure she had known during her college years, had stalked her relentlessly over the years. According to her, he had once been infatuated to the point of obsession, and his fixation had grown darker with every passing moment. She said he had been watching her, tracking her movements until one fateful night he abducted her, dragging her to this forsaken place. Even as I called for additional support, I could feel the weight of her terror, a palpable presence that gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound in the house, seemed to testify to a history of unspeakable acts of cruelty. I took careful notes, trying to secure every detail of her harrowing account, even as I battled the rising urge to flee the oppressive atmosphere of that cursed building. Leaving the house temporarily to meet with the lead detective at the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that the farmhouse was more than just a physical location. It was a silent accomplice to the dark deeds committed within. The air outside felt deceptively fresh, a stark contrast to the suffocating dread indoors, and as I drove back to the station, my mind churned over the contradictions of the night. The victim's story was disjointed, filled with half-remembered images and punctuated by terror, yet it pointed unmistakably to a deeper conspiracy. Was this the work of a single disturbed individual, or did a shadowy network lurk behind the facade of obsession? The case file already bore the weight of complexities that threatened to unravel everything we thought we knew about criminal behavior in our quiet town. And as I sat in the interrogation room later, the evidence laid out before me like a chaotic tapestry of blood, fear, and inexplicable patterns, I realized that this investigation was as much a journey into the darkest recesses of the human mind as it was a straightforward police procedural. The morning light offered little respite from the horrors of that night. The station was abuzz with conflicting theories and anxious murmurs, but beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of disquiet that ran deeper than any of us cared to acknowledge. I spent endless hours poring over surveillance tapes and cross-referencing databases, searching for any connection that could tie the disparate threads of the case together. Every new piece of evidence, the mysterious smear on the floor, the unidentifiable marks etched into the door frames, the victim's recurring mention of a labyrinthine nightmare, added another layer of complexity to an already impenetrable puzzle. In the sterile fluorescence of the station's evidence room, I began to question whether our conventional methods were sufficient. Sometimes, I wondered, the truth was so deeply embedded in a tapestry of fear and nostalgia that unraveling it demanded more than just cold logic. It required an understanding of the human psyche in its most tormented state. The investigation deepened over the ensuing days, as relentless as the creeping fog outside and as implacable as the weight of my own memories. I found myself returning to that house again and again, in dreams, in quiet moments on patrol, and in the silent corners of my mind where doubts festered. The victim, whose name remained confidential for her own protection, was taken to a safe house under the watchful care of medical and psychological professionals. Her broken recollections became the nucleus around which we built a timeline, a scattered narrative of events that spanned months, maybe years, leading up to that fateful night. I would sit for hours on end in my cramped office at the precinct, scribbling notes on everything from her disjointed statements to the minutiae of the evidence that littered the farmhouse. I was determined to trace every clue back to its origin, to find patterns in the chaos that had so far defied explanation. Late one evening, while the station was mostly empty, and the hum of malfunctioning fluorescent lights provided a steady, almost hypnotic backdrop, I revisited the case files. Amid the mundane paperwork and routine records, I found a series of notes in a faded notebook that didn't seem to belong to any officer on our roster. The scribbled handwriting recounted details that mirrored the victim's account almost word for word. The quiet sound of footsteps in the hallway, the sensation of being watched from every darkened corner, the oppressive sense of dread that came with the fall of night. The notebook ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence by a force too terrible to withstand. Was it a diary belonging to the victim, or perhaps an earlier account left behind by someone else who had encountered this malevolent presence. The eerie parallels between the two accounts were impossible to ignore. Determined to follow this tenuous lead, I arranged to re-interview a few locals who had known the victim during her college years. Their recollections painted a picture of a man who was once a charming, yet unnerving presence on campus. A man whose obsession with her had gradually darkened until it became almost pathological. One elderly professor recalled whispered warnings of his peculiar behavior, while a former roommate recounted late-night calls filled with incoherent declarations of undying devotion. Each story was a fragment of a larger mosaic that suggested not only that the man was dangerous, but that his descent into darkness might have been triggered by an unknown catalyst, a hidden trauma or descent into madness that defied logical explanation. In the process, I began to uncover hints of a wider conspiracy, whispers that suggested the possibility of organized criminal elements operating in the shadows of our community. Could it be that this case was not merely one of deranged obsession, but part of a calculated diversion designed to facilitate another heinous crime? Haunted by these questions, I turned my attention back to the farmhouse. Accompanied by a small team of detectives, I returned to the scene to search for additional clues that might have been overlooked in the haste of the previous night. The building itself seemed to have shifted in appearance, as if it were a living entity capable of disguising its true nature. In the dusty recesses of a long-forgotten storage room, we discovered a series of old photographs and documents. Among them were images of gatherings, parties, and what appeared to be clandestine meetings. Snapshots of faces that I recognized from local news reports of unresolved crimes. The evidence hinted at a deep connection between the farmhouse and a network that had operated in the shadows for years. Each photograph was like a ghost from the past, a silent witness to crimes that had been meticulously concealed by time and fear. I began to feel an unrelenting pressure, as if the secrets within those walls were not content to remain buried. They were demanding to be heard. Every night on patrol thereafter, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched by something unseen. The once familiar streets of Elk Grove became disquieting in their apparent normalcy, the flickering streetlights and winding roads whispering of hidden dangers lurking just beyond view. My dreams were plagued with fragments of that long, oppressive night, the sound of a single, labored breath in the dark, the echo of footsteps that were not my own, and the image of a smiling face that defied explanation. I kept a journal, documenting not only the facts of the case but also the insidious emotional weight that the investigation was having on me. The blurred lines between duty and personal fear began to take their toll, and I found myself questioning not only the nature of the crimes, but the very fabric of reality as I knew it. Was I chasing down a remnant of a bygone era of madness, or had I stumbled upon a living nightmare designed to unravel everything I believed about safety and justice? In quiet moments between interviews and late-night stakeouts, I would sit alone in my car, the engine idling as I replayed every detail of that night over and over in my mind. The notebook, the photographs, the confessions of terror, they all blended together into a tapestry of dread that defied logic and reason. There was something profoundly disturbing about the idea that our town, so outwardly peaceful and ordinary, might harbor secrets so dark that even the most hardened officer could feel their soul weigh heavy with uncertainty. Every piece of the puzzle beckoned me deeper into a labyrinth of deceit and horror, a maze where every turn promised only more questions and ever-deepening shadows. As the investigation pressed on into a second grueling week, I became increasingly isolated in my pursuit of the truth. My colleagues spoke in hushed tones when I mentioned the notebook and the hidden photographs, details that seemed to implicate not only the deranged stalker, but also a network of individuals operating behind a veil of respectability. Late-night shifts turned into a solitary battle against forces that blurred the lines between rational police work and inexplicable phenomena. I found myself haunted by the relentless memory of that woman's terrified face and the resonant sound of her whispered pleas. Each time I closed my eyes, the oppressive darkness of that farmhouse loomed before me, its secrets echoing in every creak of my apartment's floorboards and every flicker of the street lamp outside my window. I devoted every spare minute to cross-referencing the evidence we had collected with past unsolved cases. The web of connections was intricate and maddening. Names recurred in shadowy circles, dates overlapped in unsettling patterns, and locations, once dismissed as coincidences, began to form a sinister cartography of hidden crimes. I scoured archived newspapers, interrogated informants in the local underworld, and even revisited old case files that hinted at missing persons and unsolved disappearances. In each fragment of information, I found echoes of that night in the farmhouse, a recurring motif of abduction, terror, and inexplicable disappearances that spanned decades. There was something methodical about the way these events unfolded, as if orchestrated by an unseen hand with a penchant for psychological torment. Late one night, a breakthrough arrived in the form of a cryptic tip from a disheveled man I encountered on a quiet street corner. His eyes, wild with a mixture of fear and determination, were fixed on the horizon as if he had seen something only he could understand. He whispered of a secret meeting held in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, a gathering where those involved in the nefarious network supposedly exchanged information and planned their next moves. His words were hurried, laced with paranoia, yet they held a kernel of truth that I could not ignore. I made my way to the warehouse, my pulse racing as I navigated through deserted streets shrouded in the same impenetrable fog that had first heralded the night at the farmhouse. The warehouse was a cavernous space, its interior filled with the stale odor of neglect and the unmistakable tang of industrial chemicals. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight as I proceeded cautiously, every step measured and deliberate. Shadows stretched long and sinister across concrete floors, and the silence was punctuated by the distant, echoing sound of dripping water. I moved through the space like a ghost, alert for any sign of movement that might betray the presence of those hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, I caught sight of a figure slipping into a narrow corridor at the far end of the building. Without hesitation, I followed, my hand instinctively resting on the grip of my holstered sidearm. The corridor led to a small, locked room where I was forced to confront the stark reality of organized crime intermingled with deep-seated psychosis. Inside that cramped chamber, I found evidence of a long-standing operation. A table strewn with maps, documents, and photographs that connected names to places, linking the farmhouse mystery to a series of unsolved cases that had tormented the community for years. The names were scrawled in a mixture of neat script and hurried scribbles, and every document hinted at a web of corruption that extended far beyond one man's twisted obsession. As I pieced together the jigsaw puzzle before me, a chill of recognition ran down my spine. There were photographs of the victim from before her abduction, taken without her knowledge at various points in time, a deliberate attempt to track her movements and, perhaps, in the eyes of her captor, to mark her as an object of possession. The sheer depth of the criminal network, interwoven with personal vendettas and the dark underbelly of obsession, threatened to engulf me. I realized that I had stumbled into a labyrinth where every revelation raised more questions, where the lines between savior and sinner blurred into a tapestry of moral ambiguity. I returned to the station burdened by the weight of this new evidence. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room, which had once served as a reminder of our commitment to justice, now seemed oppressive and inadequate in the face of such overwhelming darkness. I spent countless hours in solitary contemplation, rereading the victim's statements and examining the photographs until the borders between my rational mind and the encroaching madness began to blur. The more I delved into the case, the more I questioned whether I was chasing a phantom or exposing a truth that had long been hidden behind a veneer of normalcy. The relentless pursuit of answers left me drained, physically and emotionally, yet there was a compulsion to push on, a need to unravel this conspiracy, even if it meant confronting the depths of my own fear and vulnerability. In the dead of night, as rain began to pelt the city in a cold, unrelenting barrage, I found myself alone in my car on a quiet stretch of road leading back to the farmhouse. The steady drumming of raindrops on the roof was the only sound that accompanied my thoughts, heavy with dread and the weight of inevitability. I pulled off to the side of the road, my eyes never leaving the windshield as I stared into the distance, feeling as if the darkness was watching me. The photograph I had confiscated from the warehouse, one that showed a familiar face under an unrecognizable guise, haunted me. It was as if the camera had captured not only the physical likeness of the suspect, but also the intangible aura of terror that surrounded him. Questions swirled in my mind without resolution. Who was orchestrating this nightmare? How deep did the rabbit hole go? And, most disturbingly, was I destined to become a permanent fixture in this unfolding horror? Days melted into nights as the investigation morphed into an unending quest for truth amidst creeping despair. The evidence gathered pointed to a deliberate orchestration that spanned years, maybe even decades, linking disparate crimes that had, until now, been regarded as isolated incidents. Every new detail, every whispered lead, deepened the chasm between the comfortable monotony of everyday law enforcement and the visceral terror that lay beneath. I took to revisiting the farmhouse under the cover of darkness, sometimes more than once, determined to extract every secret from its decaying walls. Each visit was a descent into a personal hell, a confrontation with memories too horrifying to fully comprehend, yet impossible to ignore. With every creak of the floor, every echoing drip of water from a broken tap, the past came flooding back, merging seamlessly with the present in an unholy communion of fear and regret. In one particularly dismal return to the scene, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my resolve, I ventured into the basement, a place that exuded a cold, unyielding presence, as though it were the repository for every unspeakable act that had ever occurred within these walls. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten storage rooms and corridors that twisted into darkness, each step forward accompanied by an internal battle between duty and the instinct to flee. I discovered a small, concealed room behind a false wall, its existence betrayed only by a subtle draft and the faint outline of a door frame that had long since been camouflaged by neglect. Inside this hidden chamber lay a collection of personal items, a diary, a box of old letters, and photographs that chronicled a series of events that were as chilling as they were inexplicable. The diary was written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, detailing the mental unraveling of a man who had once been respected in the community but had spiraled into paranoia and delusion. His final entries were fragmented, filled with desperate warnings of a presence that would consume him if he did not expose the truth. It was a testament to the slow, corrosive influence of terror, a voice from beyond the veil of sanity, urging anyone who found it to beware the long reach of darkness. Haunted by the diary's contents, I realized that the perpetrator's descent into madness was not a solitary journey, but a shared burden, one that seemed to infect every corner of the farmhouse, every mind that had crossed its threshold. The personal letters, too, painted a picture of manipulation and control. They told of promises made in hushed tones, of a need to belong to something beyond the mundane, even if that something was steeped in horror. In one letter, a phrase was repeated over and over, scrawled in the margins as if it were a chant. "The darkness binds us." The chilling mantra resonated with the oppressive atmosphere of the farmhouse, and with the raw, unyielding terror that had gripped both victim and captor. As I pieced the narrative together, I was struck by the realization that the case was not merely about a deranged stalker, but about a legacy of violence and psychological manipulation that had been silently passed down, like a cursed inheritance across generations. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I gathered evidence, my thoughts racing between protocol and instinct. I could sense that something was off. Too many details didn't fit, and the fragments of her tale hinted at a far more insidious plan. A chill that had little to do with the cold night crept over me as I stepped back into the main hall, the flashlight's beam revealing more disordered remnants of lives once lived. A broken mirror, a photograph askew on the wall, and an unidentifiable smear on the floor. A pattern of clues that teased at a deeper mystery. With backup en route, I documented the scene meticulously, my mind simultaneously operating on the precise checklist of evidence collection while grappling with a lingering sense of impending dread. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor, I knew that the night was far from over. Walking back down the narrow, creaking stairs felt as though I was dragging the weight of the building's tortured secrets with me. The woman's frantic whispers still echoed in my ears as I led her from the suffocating darkness into the uncertain relief of the hallway where the first responders had begun to gather. The palpable tension in the air thickened as the flashing lights from backup vehicles cast unpredictable shadows through broken windows and doorways. My colleagues moved with a determined urgency that contrasted with the slow, mournful decay of the farmhouse. I could sense their apprehension, the unspoken understanding that we were entangled in something far beyond a simple case of abduction gone wrong. Every officer's face was etched with concern, and the shared burden of having seen too much in the line of duty. We secured the area, took careful statements, and began collecting the scattered pieces of evidence in a room that resonated with the echoes of past horrors. The unsettling discovery of the victim's disjointed narrative soon gave way to new questions. Why was this man still free? And how had he managed to elude detection despite the meticulous planning that was now beginning to show its signs? The woman's mention of her college tormentor struck a discordant note in my memory. There had always been rumors of his descent into madness, of dark obsessions that blurred the line between passion and perversion. With every detail she shared, my grip on the gravity of the situation tightened, and I found myself reliving the countless nights spent chasing down leads and poring over case files, trying to make sense of criminal minds that defied explanation. As the forensic team combed through the house's every crevice, I found myself returning to the room where the victim had been held. There, the interplay of light and shadow on the worn wallpaper and cracked furniture seemed to tell a story of its own, a silent narrative of despair and hidden violence. I methodically retraced my steps, noting subtle details. A peculiar mark near the base of the staircase, a faint trail of something dark and viscous that led to a closed door at the rear of the second floor. My instincts screamed that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more convoluted puzzle that spanned years, perhaps decades. With each piece of evidence and every whispered confession, my certainty grew that the truth lay buried beneath layers of deception and carefully orchestrated chaos. I spent hours questioning the victim, carefully coaxing out more fragments of her memory, even as she shuddered at every word. Between trembling breaths, she mentioned a recurring nightmare, a vision of endless corridors, cold and oppressive, where a figure lurked in the darkness, always watching. It was as though the very walls of the farmhouse had absorbed the terror of its past and were now haunting the present. As the first light of dawn began to strain through the grimy windows, the urgency of her tale transformed into a desperate, almost ritualistic recounting of events that blurred reality and nightmare. I listened, documenting every nuance, every whispered detail that might one day guide us to the truth. Yet, with each passing moment, the building itself seemed to conspire against me, its decrepit spaces amplifying the weight of every secret kept hidden within its walls. Back at the station, I pored over every scrap of information, my eyes increasingly bloodshot from sleepless nights and the heavy burden of unraveling a story that seemed too vast to comprehend in its entirety. Colleagues offered hushed murmurs of concern as I recounted my latest discoveries, but the drive for answers eclipsed any caution I might have otherwise exercised. I found solace in the methodical tracing of connections, even as the lines between right and wrong blurred under the relentless pressure of the investigation. Every new lead, every deciphered note from the diary, fueled a growing obsession that I could not deny. It was as if I was being drawn inexorably into the very narrative I was trying to solve, a narrative that threatened to consume not only the truth, but also my own sense of identity. I began to document my personal reactions alongside the official report, a hidden record of the psychological toll the case was exacting from me. The work was relentless, and the more I learned, the less certain I became that there would ever be a neat resolution to the nightmare that had unfurled before me. The pressure mounted as whispers of the case reached the ears of higher-ups, and the media soon caught wind of the disturbing developments. Rumors spread like wildfire across the community, half-heard stories that painted the farmhouse as a vortex of fear and anguish, a place where the past and present collided in a frenzy of blood and despair. My nights became a blur of interrogations, evidence reviews, and desperate attempts to piece together the disparate elements of a puzzle that was as much about human frailty as it was about criminal depravity. In the midst of this chaos, I could not escape the feeling that the true horror was yet to be revealed, that in the dark recesses of my own mind, questions festering and unsolved, there lurked a final, unspeakable twist waiting to upend everything I had come to believe about justice, duty, and the nature of evil. Now, with the investigation reaching an unbearable crescendo, I found myself standing at the precipice of despair, caught between the unyielding demands of duty and the gnawing personal terror that had come to define my every waking moment. The evidence, the photographs, the diary, the eerie letters, had coalesced into a disturbing mosaic that pointed to a mastermind operating in the shadows, a puppet master whose machinations were as cunning as they were malevolent. Meetings with grim-faced detectives and sleepless nights spent poring over the collected data turned every moment into a battle against a creeping sense of helpless inevitability. I made one final, desperate decision: to re-enter the farmhouse alone. This time, not as an officer on duty, but as a man determined to confront the very heart of the darkness that had so thoroughly invaded my life. With a deep, labored breath, I retraced my steps along the narrow path that led to the cursed structure. The farmhouse loomed before me, its broken facade a silent promise of revelations and nightmares. The wind howled through the shattered windows and desolate halls as I pushed open the door once more. Each step I took seemed to echo the cumulative dread of countless souls who had suffered within these walls. This time, I was not alone. Every memory, every whisper of the past was with me, urging me onward even as rationality begged me to turn back. I ventured into the heart of the building, my flashlight beam trembling against the oppressive darkness. In the main hall, familiar objects of decay stared back at me like silent witnesses to unspeakable acts. Old photographs hung crookedly on the walls, and the very air seemed to vibrate with a palpable energy, a hunger for further revelation. Guided by a combination of intuition and methodical reasoning, I headed toward the rear of the house where a hidden door in the living room had previously gone unnoticed. Using a crowbar to pry it open, I discovered a narrow passageway leading deep into what appeared to be an underground chamber. The passage was lined with peeling wallpaper and damp concrete, and every step deeper into the subterranean labyrinth was accompanied by an intensifying sense of foreboding. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced my way through the claustrophobic space, the beam of my flashlight struggling to penetrate the thick darkness that seemed almost tangible. The corridor finally opened into a large, vaulted room whose oppressive atmosphere and stale air invoked images of ancient catacombs. In the center of that room was a makeshift altar, surrounded by objects that defied explanation. Personal items, trinkets, and what appeared to be relics from numerous victims. The sight was so macabre and unnerving that, for a brief moment, I questioned whether I could bear to record every detail. I crouched down and began a careful examination, my gloved fingers brushing aside years of dust and decay to reveal inscriptions etched into the stone. In a language that mingled archaic symbols and modern scrawl, the markings warned of a curse, of a darkness that would claim those who dared to disturb it. My mind reeled at the possibility that what I was confronting was not merely the work of a madman, but the legacy of a ritualistic vengeance spanning generations. My thoughts turned to the victim and her desperate cries for help. The realization that her abduction, her terror, and the meticulously orchestrated efforts to trap her in that nightmarish cycle were part of something far larger than any single act of criminal depravity. I could almost feel the weight of history pressing down upon me, an ancient injustice that refused to remain buried. The night I stepped into that cursed house was the beginning of an ordeal that would shatter everything I believed about order, duty, and reality. I had been on the force for nearly 15 years, and every call before had been measured, predictable. A routine disturbance, a robbery in progress, or sometimes just the eerie silence of an empty town. But on that humid evening in early October, as the radio crackled with a garbled report from a caller describing unexplainable sounds and flickering lights at an old Victorian mansion on Willow Street, I felt something deep inside shift. I pulled my patrol car over to the overgrown lot where the house loomed like a relic from a forgotten era, its dark windows staring blankly like eyes into the abyss. The building's facade was scarred by time, with peeling paint, sagging porches, and a heavy atmosphere that made every instinct scream to turn back. Yet the call had been urgent. A neighbor in a small town had sounded genuinely terrified, and as a sworn officer, I had no choice but to investigate. I approached the house cautiously, my boots crunching on broken glass and scattered leaves. The air was thick with humidity and decay. I noted every detail, the rusted hinges of the door, the intricate but now forlorn woodwork that once spoke of prosperity, and the telltale dampness seeping from the foundation. With my flashlight in hand and the weight of years of training in my chest, I forced open the door, which groaned in protest as if warning me away. Inside, the remnants of a bygone era lay in ruins. Faded wallpaper clung desperately to crumbling walls, and the floors were layered with dust that had not seen a broom in decades. Every step stirred memories of what might once have been, and my heart thudded with both duty and an inexplicable dread. I began my investigation methodically, starting at the main hall and moving slowly through winding corridors. Each room told a story. A once grand parlor now reduced to scattered debris, a dining room where a chandelier lay shattered on the floor, and a narrow staircase leading upward to the unknown depths of the house. As I ascended those creaking steps, I recalled my training. Stay alert, document everything, never assume the extraordinary isn't possible, and kept my hand near the holstered weapon, not out of anticipation of a criminal, but because something in the air felt profoundly wrong. On the second floor, my flashlight beam revealed faint, almost fresh footprints embedded in the dust. A trail that went from a child's bedroom to a door leading to what I presumed was the attic. The footprints were too small, too deliberate, and perplexingly out of place in a house believed abandoned for decades. Stepping through the doorway into the dimly lit corridor, a whisper of sound brushed past me and I froze. The quiet murmur was like a child's laugh, half giggling, half crying, its origin lost in the shadowed expanse. "Hello?" I called out, my voice betraying a mixture of authority and unease. No immediate reply came, only the oppressive silence that followed like a shroud. Determined to resolve the growing mystery with the logic ingrained in my police training, I followed the trail of footprints toward the attic stairs, each step heavier than the last as if the house itself resisted my intrusion. The attic door loomed ahead, battered and warped by time. I pushed it open slowly, and the creak of its hinges sounded like the lament of forgotten souls. Inside, the attic was a tomb of memories, piles of old furniture, dusty boxes filled with yellowed photographs and trinkets, and through a small, grimy window, the moon cast eerie patterns on the floor. I scanned the room with my flashlight and saw something that froze the blood in my veins. A single rocking chair moving by itself in a corner. Its gentle sway, as if mimicking a child's restless sleep, was impossible to dismiss as mere mechanical creaking. Every instinct told me to flee, yet professional duty compelled me to document the phenomenon, so I slowly advanced, reporting each detail into my recording device. The air was bitterly cold here, and my breath came out in short, visible puffs that mingled with the dust. My pulse pounded in my ears as I almost missed the faint whisper that followed. "You shouldn't be here." Every shadow in that attic seemed to breathe menace, and as I inched closer to the rocking chair, the atmosphere grew oppressively dense, as if the very air around me were thickening. I reached out a shaking hand to steady the chair, and in that moment, the sound of a door slamming in the distance jolted me from my reverie. The echo reverberated through the rafters and sent a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I backed away, snapping photographs and scrawling notes with trembling hands. My mind, trained to balance rational thought with the inexplicable, teetered on the brink of panic. The rational part of me argued that the building's dilapidated state and natural acoustic anomalies could explain the oddities. Yet every fiber of my being recognized that I was no longer in a mere abandoned structure, but rather in a place where something unspeakable had taken root. The oppressive dark of the night made the journey back to the street feel interminable. As I retraced my steps down the creaking stairs, the resonating echoes of my own footsteps were joined by what sounded like a rhythmic tapping, as if invisible hands were drumming along the walls. I reached the foyer to find that the once open door to the outside was inexplicably closed, trapping me momentarily. It took every ounce of strength to pry it open, and once I did, the cool night air battered against my sweat-dampened face. I didn't stop running until I was safely ensconced in my patrol car, the world beyond the house slowly coming back into focus. That car ride, with the rhythmic beat of the tires on the wet asphalt, gave me a moment to reflect on the inexplicable events. I scribbled rough notes, trying to make sense of footprints that defied decay, whispering shadows, and an almost sentient cold that clung to my skin. Yet, the true horror had only just begun. In the following days, as I attempted to process the inexplicable events of that first night, I found myself haunted by vivid nightmares and flashbacks. Every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to the cursed attic of that house, where time seemed to stand still, and the unseen eyes of the past stared unblinkingly into my soul. I began to receive anonymous tips suggesting that similar occurrences had plagued the house over generations, an endless cycle of terror that ensnared the curious and the brave alike. I made several return visits, each more harrowing than the last. On one such visit, determined to uncover a semblance of rational explanation behind the paranormal disturbances, I returned with colleagues from my precinct. We planned to secure the house and conduct a thorough investigation under controlled conditions. However, as soon as we set foot inside, an inexplicable dread overtook us. The building, it seemed, rejected our presence. Cameras malfunctioned inexplicably, recording only static in areas where the air was thickest. Our radios emitted nothing but low, mournful tones, as if the house itself had absorbed the voices and replaced them with silence. As we split up to cover more ground, I found myself alone in the parlor, a room where the past and present melded into one ominous tableau. I could almost hear the murmurs of voices, the distant echoes of an era long gone, and the unmistakable sound of a heartbeat. My own heart pounding with an intensity I had never experienced before. In that moment, I realized that the house was not simply a relic of history, but a living entity nourished by the pain, fear, and memories of those who dared to trespass within its walls. The oppressive aura was suffocating, and as the night deepened, I witnessed events that defied every rational explanation. In one instance, while inspecting a narrow corridor lined with portraits of long-dead Hartleys, I saw the eyes in each painting flicker with a cold intelligence, as if acknowledging my very presence. The sensation was overwhelming, like being watched by generations of silent witnesses, and it plunged me into a state of utter vulnerability and isolation. I made one final attempt to confront the source of these disturbances in the dead of night. Returning to the attic alone, I felt the full force of an unseen presence. The darkness pressed in on all sides, and I could feel my sanity fraying at the edges. In that suffocating gloom, I heard a distinct, measured voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Officer Carter, you are part of this house now." The words were not a threat, but a claim. As if the house had been waiting for me all along, a sacrificial element in its eternal cycle of torment. I pleaded for understanding, demanding to know what unspeakable truth lay behind my unwelcome fate. The silence that followed was more unbearable than any scream, and it was then that I realized that my every step in that accursed place was part of something much larger, a cosmic, malevolent design that defied mortal logic. I left the premises that night not as a victorious lawman, but as a broken soul burdened with a secret too ghastly to share. Yet the investigation was far from over, and the memories of that night clung to me like a second skin. The evidence I collected, unexplained footprints, distorted images on my camera, and inexplicable electromagnetic fluctuations, remained unassailable in the eyes of rational inquiry. Still, each piece was marred by a terror that could not be quantified. I reported everything in painstaking detail, my words capturing the dread that had invaded my very essence. The case was closed, or so the department claimed, but within me, a relentless determination had taken hold to return and unearth the truth hidden behind the layers of time and superstition. Days bled into weeks, and the reality of what I had encountered began to infiltrate every facet of my life. On quiet nights, while sipping lukewarm coffee in the solitude of my modest apartment, I would find myself staring blankly at the dark corners of my room, as if expecting the ghostly fingers of that malevolent force to reach through the darkness. Colleagues noticed a change in me. The once composed and methodical officer now carried an air of restless paranoia. I would often pause during routine patrols, eyes darting toward the desolate hillside where the old Hartley house stood mute witness to decades of sorrow and dread. In the midst of this inner turmoil, I began to question the very nature of reality. Was I truly being haunted by a specter from the past, or had I inadvertently become an embodiment of the house's insidious legacy, its new harbinger of despair? I soon learned that the house had a history drenched in tragedy and mystery. Digging through local records with an intensity that bordered on obsession, I discovered that the Hartley family's demise was cloaked in rumors of occult practices, forbidden rituals, and sacrifices made under the cloak of night. It was whispered that Edgar Hartley, the patriarch of the family, had sought to cheat death itself, forging an unholy pact with forces beyond mortal comprehension. His insatiable hunger for eternal life had left behind a trail of destruction, innocent lives taken in the name of his dark pursuits. The more I delved into the sordid details of that blood-stained history, the clearer it became that the house was a monument to those sins. It was a trap, meticulously designed to ensnare the vulnerable and the curious, feeding off their deepest fears. The evidence of these unspeakable acts lay scattered in cryptic diary entries, faded newspaper clippings, and cryptic symbols etched into the mansion's walls. Each artifact reinforced the same chilling conclusion. The house was alive, and it was waiting for its next victim, its next lost soul to suffer under its cursed legacy. I remember one particular incident with gut-wrenching clarity. A midnight encounter in the very heart of the mansion's grand hall. I had decided to confront the supernatural presence head-on, determined to uncover even the smallest shred of rational explanation. I stood alone in the hall, the only sound being the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky ceiling. In that heavy silence, the oppressive atmosphere congealed into a palpable force, pressing down on me like an invisible vice. Out of nowhere, the temperature plummeted, and my breath fogged up in the dim light. I thought I saw shapes moving within the shadows, ephemeral silhouettes that defied the logical constraints of time and space. The sound of whispering voices grew louder, a cacophony of indistinct murmurs that gradually morphed into comprehensible words. "Join us," they beckoned softly, repeatedly, as if chanting an incantation from a forgotten age. Their voices were seductive yet laden with despair, urging me to succumb to the terror that had infiltrated every corner of my being. In that moment, my mind split into a duel of sanity versus the supernatural, and I could feel a psychological pressure mounting, a force so potent it threatened to shatter my very identity as an officer, as a rational being. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my duty compelled me to stand my ground. The battle within me was fierce. The disciplined, logical part of my mind clashed with an unyielding terror rooted deep within my soul. The silence that followed was more excruciating than the noise of a siren, and as I mustered the strength to take a step forward, I knew that the true horror of this place was not merely what lay visible in its decaying walls, but the psychological torment it inflicted upon every visitor who dared challenge its malevolent power. After that night, I emerged from the mansion with scars that went beyond the visible. I became a man haunted, both in the waking world and in dreams, and yet a fragment of me, driven by an unquenchable thirst for the truth, could not forget the whispered promises of the house. It called to me in moments of fleeting solitude, echoing through my thoughts, urging me to return and piece together the history of its sorrow. Even now, as I report these events with the precision of an officer bound by duty, a dark part of me wonders if my relentless pursuit of answers is itself a descent into madness. The mansion has imprinted itself on my soul, and every detail, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye is a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The night I left the Hartley mansion was shrouded in a heavy, unrelenting sadness. A final farewell to a place that had not only consumed the lives of those it had touched before, but was now determined to claim mine as well. I drove away slowly, every mile a struggle against the pull of dread that threatened to overtake me. The road ahead felt endless, and as I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, I swore I could see the mansion's silhouette looming in the distance, its dark windows winking in a silent, mocking farewell. When dawn broke, I was a different man, haunted, yet compelled by a need for closure. I began to compile every detail, every inexplicable occurrence, into reports and personal journals. I sought to establish a chronology, to understand the patterns of this supernatural affliction. But as the weeks passed, the mansion's influence seeped further into my life. I found myself stepping away from duty, my nights plagued by relived horrors, my days burdened by a guilt that I could not explain. For every rational explanation I conjured, another anomaly emerged to question my sanity. In one unsettling instance, while reviewing my case files at the precinct, I overheard a conversation among fellow officers whispering about a series of strange incidents around town. Stories of eerie lights, disembodied voices, and inexplicable disappearances near forgotten structures. The common denominator was clear: an insidious force, one that did not respect boundaries of logic or geography, had latched onto our quiet community and refused to let go. There came a time when routine patrols turned into unwitting investigations of phenomena that defied legal parameters, as more citizens reported uncanny sightings around the old mansion and elsewhere along Willow Street. With mounting reluctance, I found myself drawn back into the vortex of this mystery. Each return to that accursed place was a desperate attempt to find answers and perhaps to sever the house's hold on my fractured psyche. I documented every detail, every sound and shadow with an almost obsessive intensity. My reports became longer, interwoven with personal confessions of terror and a longing for redemption, as if exposing the depths of my fear might somehow dispel the dark force that had taken root within me. I spent countless nights in the town's small, windowless station house, poring over historical records, old maps, and archival photographs of the mansion in its prime. I began to piece together a mosaic of tragedies and inexplicable events, a tapestry that wove together folklore and cold, hard evidence. Yet, for every shred of information I unearthed, another layer of mystery emerged, inviting me deeper into a labyrinth of despair and unanswered questions. In the quiet hours before dawn, when silence was most oppressive, I would sometimes hear that same soft, insidious giggle, an echo of children lost in time, of hope long extinguished. I understood then that my role was more than that of an investigator of crimes. I had become the reluctant chronicler of a dark chapter in our town's history, one that even the most seasoned officers would rather never discuss. I tried to warn my colleagues, even sent a few detailed memos to my superiors, but every time I mentioned the mansion's true nature, I was met with skepticism. "Stress, Officer Carter," they would say, or "You're reading too many ghost stories." Yet the evidence was irrefutable for me. I had experienced it firsthand. The way the air seemed to thicken with malevolence, the disembodied voices that echoed through deserted corridors, the ghostly silhouettes that flitted at the edge of vision. Each unsolvable anomaly drove home one unmistakable truth. The mansion was a living paradox of beauty and horror, a place where the very fabric of reality was woven with threads of madness and despair. Through it all, the mansion remained a constant, lurking presence, a reminder that no matter how much we rely on order and reason, some places exist outside of its jurisdiction. And as I continued to fight the encroaching darkness in my own mind, I realized that the mansion was not merely a building, but a manifestation of every unspeakable secret, every hidden torment that we as a society choose to bury deep within our collective memory. The more I delved into its lore, the more I was consumed by it, until the line between duty and obsession blurred beyond recognition. I now stand at the crossroads between what is known and what is unfathomable, burdened by memories that threaten to fracture my sanity. The mansion on Willow Street cast a long, unyielding shadow over not only the town, but also my very soul. A shadow that refuses to dissipate even in the brightest light. And though I have tried to move on, the echoes of that cursed place persist, haunting me like a specter in every quiet moment. I drive tonight with that same silent dread, the ghost of the mansion ever present in my thoughts. Every mile, every darkened stretch of road reminds me that my journey is far from over. In the depths of my mind, I hear one final, unsettling whisper, one that promises that the answers I seek may come at the highest price of all. As I approach a bend in the road, the memory of that forsaken house grows clearer, the silhouettes of long-dead souls dancing in the corner of my vision. I cannot shake the feeling that some questions should never be answered, that some doors should never be opened, because once you cross that threshold, the night holds secrets too terrible to bear. And so, with a heart heavy with unresolved terror and a mind teetering on the edge of certainty and madness, I continue forward into the unknown, a lone officer haunted by a past that continues to demand its due. The mansion waits, silently insistent, its dark promise lingering in the back of my mind. As the headlights cut through the darkness of the deserted road, I cannot help but wonder, is it truly an investigation into the supernatural? Or have I merely become another ghost in its cursed legacy, doomed to wander endlessly in search of an elusive salvation? The journey back to Willow Street was forced by a compulsion that I could no longer control, a need to confront the horror that had tethered itself to my soul. I returned on a night when the moon was hidden behind layers of oppressive clouds, cloaking the world in an inky darkness that seemed fit for the macabre. My car rolled slowly along the desolate lane, the only sound the rhythmic thud of the tires against the uneven asphalt and the murmured wind that carried memories of restless spirits. With every passing mile, the dread swelled within me, a dark tide carrying me inexorably toward the place where my nightmares had first taken form. Pulling up at the iron gate that marked the mansion's boundary, I parked my car with the precision of a seasoned officer, yet with the tremor of a man who has seen too much. The rusted gate squealed loudly as I pushed it open. In that moment I felt the pull of something unseen, a magnetic force that drew me toward the front door. The house stood silently, its dark windows like empty eyes scrutinizing my every move. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and stepped into the overgrown courtyard that reeked of decay and despair. The air was thick with an unspoken malevolence, and as I approached the entrance, every instinct screamed in protest. I reminded myself of my duty, a duty to protect, to serve, and to uncover the truth, no matter how unspeakable it might be. I entered through the same door I had once forced open, only now it felt as though it recognized me, creaking softly in acknowledgement of my return. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the feeble beam of my flashlight the only herald of my approach. Every step echoed in the emptiness, resonating in tandem with the unsteady beat of my heart. I retraced familiar corridors, each one laden with spectral memories. The living room lay as I had left it, with its half-collapsed ceiling and furniture draped in dusty white sheets. The faint outlines of footprints were still visible on the floor, a silent testament to the presence of those long since gone, yet somehow ever present. My eyes scanned the room for any signs of movement. Then, as if in answer to my silent plea, I heard a soft creak behind me. I spun around, weapon drawn, only to find an indistinct shadow flitting just out of reach. The rational part of my mind warred against the rising tide of dread. I pressed forward, recording every detail, every anomaly that might unravel the mystery of this unholy place. As I ventured further, the house seemed to adjust to my presence. The oppressive atmosphere thickened, merging with the raw intensity of my recollections and fears. I moved past the hall where I had once seen the apparition of a man in an old-fashioned suit, an image that has since tormented every quiet moment of solitude. Now, I approached the door to the basement, a place I had avoided on previous visits due to an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Tonight, I resolved, I would confront it head-on. Steadying myself, I descended the narrow staircase, each step a reminder that I was treading on the threshold between the known and the unspeakable. In the damp subterranean chamber below, I discovered remnants of rituals long abandoned, circular markings scrawled on the concrete floor, old and tattered documents in strange, archaic handwriting, and symbols that defied all conventional explanation. My flashlight revealed deeper darkness than I had anticipated. It was as if the basement itself were a void, swallowing light and hope alike. I knelt down, examining the symbols, my trained eyes trying to decipher a language of despair. Every line and curve told a story of obsession, sacrifice, and an unyielding hunger for power. I realized, with a deep, shuddering certainty, that Edgar Hartley's dark legacy was not merely a figment of ghost stories. It was a carefully constructed labyrinth of occult practices that transcended the natural laws of this world. Above ground, the wind picked up, its mournful howl carrying with it the voices of the past. I ascended back into the main corridors, mentally preparing myself for the next inevitable confrontation. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its once elegant banister now splintered and stained with time. As I reached the top, a sense of imminent danger gripped me, a feeling that my every step was leading me closer to a fate I could no longer escape. In the narrow corridor at the end of the hall, I encountered a mirror, its surface dusty and cracked. For a fleeting moment, I swear I saw behind my own reflection the faint outline of a man, his expression twisted in a macabre semblance of a smile. My heart pounded violently as I backed away from the mirror, unwilling to dwell on a trick of the light. Yet, deep down, I knew that the mansion was not done with me yet. In that charged moment, every memory, every horrifying detail of my previous encounters surged forward like a tidal wave. I could almost hear that insidious whisper, so familiar, so impossibly clear, "Join us." It was a call not only to surrender to the darkness, but to embrace it, as though my very soul were already claimed. The weight of that realization crashed down on me, a relentless pressure that threatened to erase the boundaries between duty and despair. As I stood there, trembling in a state of suspended terror, I realized that every investigation, every rational explanation, had only brought me face to face with an overwhelming, lurking insanity. I pressed my back against the cool, damp wall of the corridor, trying in vain to steady my racing pulse. The mansion, with its labyrinthine passages and ghosts of history, had become an extension of my own fractured psyche. In that vulnerable state, every sound, the creak of wood, the rustle of unseen fabric, the faint scuttle of something inexplicable in the dark, became a harbinger of doom. I fought to regain control of my thoughts, to remind myself that I was a police officer bound by logic and duty. And yet, the mansion's enigmatic allure was overpowering, beckoning me ever deeper into its secrets, its horrors, and its inevitable grip on my life. At that point, as I stood on the precipice of understanding and utter madness, a final, bone-chilling realization struck me. No matter how far I might venture into the heart of this unspeakable terror, the truth would remain maddeningly elusive, forever just out of reach. Each step into the darkness was both a revelation and a descent into a realm where human logic dissolved into chaos. The mansion was not merely a physical structure, it was a living testament to the eternal struggle between light and shadow, a mirror reflecting the fragility of our convictions in the face of the supernatural. I stepped back into the night with more questions than answers, my mind reeling from the overwhelming influx of horror and despair. The wind carried the echo of that final whisper, a haunting reminder that my fate was irrevocably entwined with the cursed legacy of the mansion. As I drove away along the lonely road, its dark curves and uncertain turns mirrored the labyrinth of my thoughts. The light from my car's headlights illuminated patches of the roadside, yet left vast expanses of darkness untouched, much like the corners of my mind that now harbored the mansion's secrets.